Bonjour, bon matin. Good morning to all. My name is Jeff Nankerville. I'm the President and CEO of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. It's my honor to kick things off this morning. I shall be brief. Let me begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're grateful to all of Canada's First Nations for their stewardship of the lands on which we live, play, and occasionally work. This is one of those places. I'm really looking forward to today's discussions. I'm an international relations graduate of University of Toronto, right here at Trinity College, and that makes me, I think, according to the people who collect alumni donations, that makes me a retroactive Munk alum. So I feel at home, and I'm ready. I'm in a mode. I'm ready to take notes. So I don't want to get in the way of that. I would like to say just a couple of things. I had a career as a diplomat for Canada, and then 4.5 years ago came to the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada to be the president and CEO. And it is a fact, I think, that Canada is, among our peer countries, a country whose ecosystem for think tanks, for policy research, is, let us say, I would say it's still underdeveloped. We have some great shining examples across the country, and the Munk School, with whom we partner at APF Canada, we partner on many events. The Munk School is a leading light. So I'm not talking about Munk here, and there are a number of other leading institutions across the country. But I think it is the case that relative to many of our peers, there's much more room for us to develop that ecosystem. And I think we all have a responsibility to do that. It's one we take very seriously at Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. And that's why you will see us partnering, continuing to partner and to work together with other institutions and centers across Canada to help in our little corner of the ecosystem, which is now a much bigger corner, to help connect thought leaders, emerging thought leaders, future thought leaders across Canada to counterparts and interlocutors across the Indo-Pacific region. And obviously there's never been a better time to do that. It's never been more important than it is now. Among the tools we have in our toolkit, and I could go on at this point, but I won't, about the many things that we do in Asia and in Canada. Today is a day to put a spotlight on the John McArthur Fellowships. So John McArthur was a very distinguished Canadian who for many years was the dean of the Harvard Business School. And there are literally generations of graduates of the school who benefited from his wisdom and his insights. And when he retired from the school, he moved back to his native British Columbia, and he was, for a number of years, the chair of the board of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. And when John passed away at the end of the last decade, a number of his graduates, and trust me, this is a very distinguished group of Canadians, got together and raised an endowment and entrusted us at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada with managing that endowment. And so since 21, those resources have been used to fund a number of activities. The fellowship endowment has brought distinguished speakers to Canada, distinguished international speakers to Canada. In the initial years, the focus now has become to really use those resources to help to support leading Canadian scholars to do research that will be impactful. And you'll hear, I think you're going to see what the effect of that is now. But I'm delighted that we at the foundation and under the leadership of our Vice President Vina Nadjibulla and her team that we have been able to really deploy these resources in consultation with the committee members, currently led by Kevin Lynch and Carol Lee, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. They're at opposite ends of the country from where we are today. But working with them to help to use these additional resources to spur new scholarship and thought leadership in Canada. So before I conclude, I would like to say, again, a thanks to our good friends and colleagues at the Munk Center, to Janice Stein and her team who've worked with us to put this event together, and the team at the Asian Institute. We're really delighted to have this opportunity. I'm grateful to all of you for being with us. If you don't subscribe to Asia Watch, our weekly newsletter, make sure that you do. We're happy to provide you with that information. And I'm really looking forward to the day. Alors, je vais terminer par là. Now I have the great privilege and honor to get you into the program, and I can go back to my student days and start taking notes. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, Vice President of Research and Strategy, Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, Vina Nadjibulla.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that wonderful welcome, and good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to see a full room on a rainy day in Toronto. Very warm welcome to folks who've traveled from far away. One of our John McArthur Fellows for this year, Kati Suominen, has come all the way from California, much warmer, no doubt, and more pleasant. We also have our fellows from Ottawa, Pascale Massot from University of Ottawa, as well as Dr. Ari Van Assche from Montreal. And of course, it's wonderful to see also our keynote speaker who's come from Washington, D.C., Lizzi C. So the point is that we've been able to bring a global group together and an audience that hopefully will engage fully in a conversation about Canada's economic security and resilience, and what that means in the context of doing more trade and investment in Asia in particular. As Jeff mentioned, the focus of the John McArthur Fellows Fellowship Program has been on supporting mid-career Canadian scholars and their research, policy-relevant research on the Indo-Pacific and Canada engagement. But for this year's program, we expanded the focus also to include the U.S., recognizing that U.S. policies towards Asia, and especially U.S.-China competition, has a profound impact on how Canada is recalibrating its own engagement with Asia, and certainly with China especially. And as we look at issues around supply chains, around economic security or export controls, and all of the various tools that the US has been deploying, that has profound implication for Canada. So that's why this year's fellowship program also includes Kati, who is based in the US, and the focus of this symposium also has an opening keynote from a scholar based in the US. So again, that idea of looking at the triangle of Canada, Asia, Canada, US, and US, Asia, and particularly US, China. And of course, when we speak about the Indo-Pacific, it's not just about China, but there is so much that China's remarkable rise over the last 20 years has done to reshape global trade, global economic order, as well as supply chains. And of course, China's technical innovation, and especially when it comes to green economy and green technology, as well as frontier technologies, has profound implications for how we're thinking about Canada's economic competitiveness and economic policies. So these are big topics. We will try to address them as much as we can over the course of the next 3 hours. The program for today, like I said, will include a keynote presentation from Lizzi Lee, and then we have 2 panels that will we'll be featuring our 4 John MacArthur scholars. The reason I haven't mentioned Danielle Goldfarb yet, who's our 4th fellow, is because I don't know if she's made it. She was having some medical issues today, so if we only end up with the 3, that's the reason for that, but you will be hearing a little bit about her research in the context of the discussion as well. Everybody's details and long bios and very distinguished bios are in the agenda, and you can also scan it. So we won't be doing too many long introductions because, again, that can take the full 3 hours, given the remarkable background of our fellows as well as other panelists that we've brought together for these discussions. So starting with Lizzi Lee's keynote, Lizzi is a fellow at the she's a fellow of Chinese economy at the Asia Society Policies Institute China Center, which is a fairly recent center established about 4 years ago by Kevin Rudd, a former Prime Minister of Australia and also former Ambassador of Australia to the US, someone who led Asia Society very ably, now has actually come back to be the President of Asia Society again. So Lizzi's part of that really entrepreneurial team at the China Center and leads their work on China's economy and technology. She also co-leads 2 major initiatives, one on the art of dealing with China, which supports multinational companies in their dealing with China, and another one on the business of being well, which examines the frontier of China's health economy. She has a very interesting background. After doing her PhD in economics at MIT, she pursued a career in journalism, not something that one does often. And she did that for 2 years out of the US, looking again at China and telling the China story to a broader audience than just the academic one. This morning I asked her why the transition, why do a PhD in economics at MIT and then become a journalist? And she mentioned that she wanted her work to be read by more than 5 people, and that as an academic, you work really hard and you have a relatively narrow audience. So now she has found the best of both worlds, where she can do rigorous research at a think tank and an institution like the Asia Society, but also still have a broad audience, including from business, as well as the policy community. So we're absolutely thrilled, Lizzi, that you've taken the time to travel to a fairly cold Toronto. I can see that your jacket is still on you, so I hope the conversation will warm you up. We're really excited to hear your thoughts on China's Industrial Strategy 2.0 in particular. You've been writing quite a bit lately. For those of you who follow Lizzi, I don't know how she does it. She had a wonderful piece in Foreign Affairs just last fall, looking at the much talked about concept of overcapacity or involution in China. So I hope she'll be able to unpack that and what that means for Canada's industrial strategy and competitiveness, as well as looking at technology, including the most recent much talked about deal with Manus and Meta. So we couldn't have a better person, definitely a rising star in the China analyst community to give the keynote this morning. Thrilled to have you. Lizzi, the floor is yours. Welcome.
All right, thank you so much. That was obviously an overgenerous introduction of me, but for the Asian daughters in this room who wanted to learn how to negotiate with your parents after your PhD program to not become a professor or a lawyer or on Wall Street, please sign up for my MOOC course. I feel like I have a potential career after my policy career. So that's number one. Number two, we at Asia Society, we're also trying to put some constraint on Kevin. You're on your 2nd term. Please do not return for a 3rd term. Otherwise, we know the examples out there. You are not in, let's say, you are not in the company of world leaders to be admired across the board. But finally, 3rd, let's talk about China's economics and technology, which should be the focus of the keynote. But as Vina mentioned, I'm coming up from Washington, D.C. Well, I have to say, these days, despite the rain, I still appreciate Canada just a little more, just because I'm coming up from Washington, D.C., our calm, steady neighbor to the north of our border. Because Washington these days really has a way of pulling every conversation into its orbit. The headlines are really hard to follow these days. But I think the real, if quieter, center of gravity of conversation in DC it's not about Washington. It's not even about America. The real elephant in the room is not even in the room in the US. And that elephant is China. So when I talk to policymakers, when I talk to industry leaders, when I talk to scholars, the one question I get asked most often is how do we make sense of China's evolving economic and technological strategy? What does it mean for the rest of us? So that's a topic I want to share my 2 cents, but also I would love to hear your insights on. Let me just start with a simple observation. For a few decades, when we think about China's role in the global economy, it's kind of easy to describe. It was a world's factory, so to speak. China was deeply plugged into global supply chains, but also very reliant on foreign technology, foreign investment. And its economic growth model was very much powered by globalization, powered by, or at least, I think the momentum was powered by exports. But that version of China is being rewritten on a daily basis. What we are seeing is a structural upgrade in how China positions itself in the global economy. And critically, it's not driven by success solely. Paradoxically, I think it's driven by both pressure from the outside and China's own ambition from within. So you have pressure from the inside and from the outside. And critically, this structural upgrade is not happening in a stable world. It's unfolding precisely at a moment when the global system itself is becoming much more fractured, much more contested. As Prime Minister Mark Carney put it at Davos, paraphrasing him, we're not gliding through a transition. We're actually living through a rupture. And I think China's strategy starts to make more sense when you see it through that lens, in that context. So what does this structural upgrade actually look like? I think it boils down to 3 shifts. The first is what I call an all-out drive for technological self-reliance. The second shift, I think, is a complete rewiring of global supply chain, not just any supply chains that are critical for the future. The third shift, or structural upgrade, I think is a far more deliberate and strategic use of interdependence, of economic dependence on China. And I think that's the most critical. It is still very much unfolding change that we are observing on a day-to-day basis. So let me take these one by one. First, this all-out drive for tech self-reliance. China is no longer content to assemble the world's products. It wants to design them upstream, wants to power them, and it wants to define the standards behind them. Part of it is defensive. A lot of this tech self-reliance drive is a response to external constraints, export controls, for example. But much of it is also forward-looking. China is trying to make sure that in the technologies that matter the most for the future, it will never be structurally dependent on someone else, especially not the United States. And how does China do it? Well, we know this model, combining top-down policy support with bottom-up private sector competition and innovation. And this model, this tool, works particularly well in sectors where infrastructure, scale, coordination, and speed are decisive. Solar, EV, energy storage, et cetera, including things like industrial robots, AI applications, AI tools, et cetera, et cetera. So the result, I think, is a very fundamental shift. China is not just an important node in the global supply chain. It's becoming a system in its own right. And it's an integrated, highly innovative, and highly powerful system. It's really hard to shake that system from the outside. The second shift I want to talk about, supply chain reconfiguration. So, I talk about China's self-reliance drive. There's this, cute phrase, fortress China, that gets used a lot in the media. I think it captures the gist of the idea, but also misses some of the nuances. So why am I saying that? Well, yes, China is reducing reliance. A lot of foreign inputs in critical areas. But at the same time, China is also building new supply chain networks, reaching deep into the global economy. China is deepening ties with, say, Southeast Asia. In Global South, China is also doubling down where it already holds an edge, for example, clean energy, batteries, EVs, and critical minerals. So we'll be talking about overcapacity later on. But that competitiveness becomes China's tools, those tentacles, those new pathways into the global trade and tech landscape. So instead of one global supply chain, we're actually moving toward a web of overlapping global supply chains. And China is making sure it sits at the center of as many of them as possible. It's really hard to disentangle China from the global supply chain. The third structural upgrade I mentioned is this more strategic, more deliberate use of economic interdependence. I think this is where the China question becomes most visible and most consequential. Economic relations are increasingly viewed by Beijing as assets, geopolitical assets, China's source of leverage, China's source of influence. As my colleague Pascale would know, we see this very clearly in critical minerals. And it's not just critical minerals. So what's China's strategy here? China's strategy is to embed itself deeply in those industries, that others cannot function without it. China is the gravity, not just of economics, but also of geopolitics, because economic relations are so central to geopolitics, and China is so deeply embedded in those critical economic relationships, so the geopolitical weight follows. At a high level, this new playbook by China actually looked quite remarkably consistent with the playbook of the old China. What I mean by that, so that's the consistency part. Over time, China uses industrial policy to jumpstart new industries, help domestic firms scale, help support them innovate. And by the way, Chinese entrepreneurs are some of the best. They can really pull their weight. And once those firms reach critical mass, because China's domestic demand is still very anemic, very constrained, those firms expand outwards. Sometimes by flooding global markets with very competitively priced products, squeezing out rivals who can just keep up. Sometimes, frankly, by producing much better stuff, much more innovative stuff at a very competitive price. How do you compete with that? And we've seen this pattern repeat over and over again. in batteries, policy support helped Chinese firms like CATL, BYD rise, and now they have global dominance. Dominance is not even an exaggeration. You just cannot compete with them. And now they control much of the supply chain of batteries, of clean energy. In semiconductor, nowadays we focus on the 7 nanometers, the EUVs, the 2 nanometers, whether China can catch up to the United States on the frontier. But let's not forget, China has built formidable capacity in mature nodes of the semiconductor supply chain. And frankly, those mature nodes are more critical for global supply chains. They are in our cars, they are in our electronics, or in our appliances. It's not just the frontier that matters. China is doing that while also controlling key inputs into the semiconductor supply network. Gallium, germanium, those critical minerals that I cannot pretend to be understand or pronounce even. And the pharmaceuticals, which I just wanted to flag, as Vina mentioned, health industry is a critical area that we're watching, and I think it's critical for U.S.-China cooperation and also competition. In pharmaceuticals, China has become the backbone supplier of essential ingredients for global drug production and therapy, and China is also quickly innovating at the forefront here. That's going to have major, major implications for global health, for human life, quite literally. And once China's position is secured, Beijing has shown it's willing to use it. Through rare earth export controls, through licensing requirements, very cumbersome licensing requirements for multinational companies operating in China, or restrictions when China's strategic interests are at stake, especially vis-a-vis the United States. And I think this is where countries like Canada should come to focus. If you think about Canada's positioning with, between the United States and China, by the way, we as a society, we also talk to a lot of policymakers in Europe, a lot of, what we call middle power countries. Canada is a topic of the room. People are watching this very interesting pivot, recalibration of Canada's strategy. Canada is very much phrased as both a thought experiment, a pilot, and a potential example to be modeled after. And Canada is in a very interesting position. It's tightly bound to the United States in terms of trade, in terms of energy. It's also very economically linked to China. And Canada, I think, correctly, is increasingly aware that neither relationship can be left on autopilot. As Prime Minister Carney put it, paraphrasing him again, so in this era of a global system that's making some fundamental changes, the system that we're familiar with that can deliver both prosperity and security is over, and I agree with that assessment. Middle powers, we have to be able to build those outcomes for ourselves. Which is why I think I'm so fortunate to join this room of brilliant thinkers and doers to brainstorm and try to strategize at this very critical juncture. Because I think you guys are at the center of the stage. But before I conclude, let me just draw out 3 high-level challenges that I would love to hear your insights on. First, we talk about this phrase, shared resilience, a lot. How do we actually achieve it? Well, we're not looking to decouple from China for sure, but we're also not comfortable with our invisible dependencies on China. How do we actually stay open while staying resilient? How do we actually stay connected without being vulnerable? How do we actually make those choices? Shared resilience is easy to say. How do we actually do it? There's a very delicate balance here. I'm not sure I have the answer to that, by the way. And the second challenge, I think, is we need to seriously think about supply chains as a matter of geopolitical strategy. Supply chain is not the most sexy word, in your dictionary. Let me just say, in DC, for a lot of ambitious policy folks, they are actually getting down to the nitty-gritty of supply chains, learning the name of the rare minerals, that kind of stuff, to understand, get their hands dirty to actually figure out what's going on. Where is China across our global supply chains? Because it's quite literally everywhere, and we don't understand that. Any supply chain strategy nowadays will inevitably have a geopolitical dimension. Geopolitics, that's sexy. That's why they are studying supply chain. And China is deeply intertwined in those supply chains, and China hold key choke points. But where are our points of leverage? And when and how should we use it? Can they function as effective tools of deterrence? I think those are the key questions policymakers need to think smartly and seriously about. And the third challenge, which I think is also important, it comes up a lot in my discussions with policymakers and also industry stakeholders across the global south and also across Europe. We need to think about the internal disagreements, inevitable disagreements in this so-called middle power moment. Middle powers can demonstrate leadership when they act as collective conveners within the ally system. Middle powers are not on the sidelines. We're on the field. We have agency. Yes, we know that. But middle power countries also have very different priorities. We have our disagreements. We have varying relationship with the United States and with China. How do we actually form those cohesive, robust, but also flexible networks of issue-based coalitions, sub-coalitions people talk a lot about? And by the way, Canada is moving in this direction. And I think that's very smart, diversifying trade, strengthening ties with Europe, Indo-Pacific in general, and also building those flexible coalitions on issues ranging from critical minerals and AI governance and so on and so on. And I think why this moment, while full of pressure, is also one of possibility for Canada, which is why I'm just so fortunate to be in this room, repeating myself. Oh, by the way, as I mentioned to Vina, I'm also a proud permanent resident of Canada. Currently, I'm shopping for my permanent home between the United States and Canada. I have to say, I don't travel to Canada very often, but Canada gets an extra vote. So if you think of those as little jars with marbles, the marble jar for Canada is just overflowing at the moment, and I have to take out more marbles from this place called the United States. But don't put that on social media. I might get a mean tweet back from President Trump. So I will conclude there, and I'm very much looking forward to a very fruitful morning of discussion.
Let you go on first. Lots of seats to choose from.
Just sit closer.
Okay, good. I don't have the mics on. Great. Well, thank you so much, Lizzi, for that absolute tour de force in terms of covering important topics of China's own economic and tech strategy, as well as looking into what that means for Canada, and then also laying some challenges that we should all be thinking about. So I want to pick at every element that you raised, but maybe first starting with the kind of the shifts that you're seeing, the three shifts that you mentioned with respect to China, and starting specifically on the all-out drive for technological self-sufficiency. A key area that many policymakers are watching now is in this new era of looking at AI and frontier technologies, kind of moving beyond just the batteries and the EVs and solar. will the model that you so ably described that China has deployed around scale and infrastructure in this kind of top-down and bottom-up approach, is that model sustainable, especially given what we saw a couple of years ago in terms of a crackdown on the private sector and the changes essentially within China? Can that party state-driven innovation continue? What are you seeing in the state-private sector relationship, especially, again, when it comes to frontier technologies?
Great question. Oh, sorry. So I recently wrote an article for Foreign Affairs unpacking what Beijing policymaker is calling the strategy of golden goose. So what's the strategy of golden goose? China knows. China's real innovative force is this private sector. If you look at China's state-led, semiconductor and AI initiative, big fund 1.0, big fund 2.0. Now we are in round 3, big fund 3.0. Lots of cash flowed to the SOEs, the public firms. They didn't deliver. If we take the scorecard of Big Fund 1.0, 2.0, lots of corruption scandals, lots of wasted resources. A lot of the SOE leaders ended up in jail. But take a look at DeepSeek. Take a look at Unitree. The real stunning innovators of China are coming from this place called Hangzhou, in southern China, close to Shanghai. Why? There's a very vibrant private entrepreneurial ecosystem. Those are China's best bets for future innovation. And Beijing knows it. Beijing knows those are its golden geese. But here's a question for Xi Jinping, which we talk more in the Foreign Affairs article. That's Xi Jinping's golden goose paradox. How do you mobilize the resource of the golden goose, but also tether it so that it doesn't fly away? What if you feed the golden goose and it becomes so strong and it wants freedom and it just fly away? That's a tension. And it's not an easy problem.
So control versus innovation.
Control versus innovation. And by the way, so I, in kind of 2 separate pieces for Foreign Affairs I wrote in the past year, which I think is actually very related. The overcapacity piece fundamentally is about how China's institution, how China's politics shape its trajectory for innovation technology, and both the good and bad. The second piece is a reverse question. Can China recalibrate its political institution, its politics, so that it can actually nurture the kind of innovation China wants? And I think for China, the second part is actually a harder question, because the political instinct is to control. But the political imperative to compete with the United States is to innovate. And my bet is that the centrality of economic and tech competition with the United States will force recalibration of China's political model. And we are seeing several very interesting reforms on that area. First, when we talk about regulations, remember, I think, quite a few years ago when N Group's IPO was pulled last minute, that really sent a chill down China's tech sector. And a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs, they just pull back. Jack Ma was very much the ringleader of China's private entrepreneurs. There was an investment chill across the board after that. China learned a lesson. When you want to control someone, you can't just do the shock therapies all the time. So now China is institutionalizing a set of rules, data regulation, private entrepreneur protection laws, golden shares. So a lot of formalization of those boundaries. And here, I think, is what's behind that strategy. A lot of the entrepreneurs, they are afraid to innovate, not because they inherently don't want to innovate is because they don't know where the boundaries are. What if if I do it, if I make it, then I become the next Jack Ma? So I'm going to tell you where the boundaries are. I'm going to draw a really bright line, but I'm also going to tell you within that boundary, you can do whatever you like. So, if you take the example of Alibaba basically made a strategic pivot. By the way, Jack Ma was re-embraced by Xi Jinping just last year in a highly, highly televised symposium. Xi Jinping is like on CCTV shaking hands with Jack Ma, that kind of stuff. Why? Alibaba is pivoting toward AI and cloud, and those are strategically aligned with Beijing's new priority. It used to be this sprawling platform company, into financial services, into everything. Financial services, finance, is highly, highly politically sensitive area for Beijing. But now it's all about cloud infrastructure, all about supporting Beijing's AI ambition. You are back in the fold.
So in some way, you're saying that the party is actually coming up with new ways of ensuring innovation while also maintaining control. So this idea that the golden goose is not going to fly away if you essentially have a long enough leash that allows it to be free enough to innovate, but also be very clear out what the controls are. So that the kind of the shocks of the last couple of years are now changing into much more clear regulations, guardrails that China is putting in place. And it's, I guess in some ways, it's an experiment in the making, and we'll see whether that succeeds. But what I found interesting in what you mentioned was that in some ways, that's the external pressure of competition with the US that's making China be much more focused on this kind of new contract or new relationship with its dynamic private sector, which it needs to be able to win the strategic competition with the US. So then the question becomes, if the US continues on some of what many would argue self-defeating policies and actually surrenders the competition prematurely, what would that mean in terms of the impact on China? And that's something that we don't necessarily need to unpack right now, but I do feel that that theory of the fact that there's a political imperative for Beijing to give more freedom to its private sector comes from the need to win the strategic competition. But if that strategic competition is increasingly looking like China is winning because US is not actually fully stepping up, I think that changes that equation a little bit. But, and we can talk about that, but I also want to move to the second point because there was so much richness in what you presented, and I want to at least put on the table as many of the themes as possible, and then hopefully our two panels will also further unpack them. This idea of China fully reshaping the global supply chains and really reordering global trade, and especially what that means in Southeast Asia and more beyond. So I want you to tease that out a little bit more in terms of what then that means for those countries like Canada who are trying to engage much more with Southeast Asia. Sort of what are the, and coming into this idea of not just made in China 2025, but maybe, as you could put it, made too much in China, right? And then what that means for industrial strategies of other countries in Southeast Asia, as well as more globally and for Canada.
Absolutely. I think that's really the million-dollar question. I will try to take a crack at addressing it. So as I mentioned, if there's, if you want to summarize the key contradiction of China's economic model is that it's a model that is extraordinary as jumping start things, as scaling, as expanding, as speeding up. But it's also a system extremely bad at slowing down, as pivoting, at changing direction. Cutting capacity is much, much harder for China, which is why I think this so-called overcapacity evolution problem is not going to stop here. You are already seeing overcapacity in robotics. Can you believe it? We think of robotics in nascent industry. You're already seeing, robotic companies losing money because they're competing over doing the same stuff, the dancing robots everywhere. Overcapacity is also emerging in drones. In China's new low-altitude economy, it's happening everywhere. Not because China is not worried about, not because Beijing is not worried about trade tensions. It's so worried about trade tensions. But just because the model, the incentives are wired in that way, that's really, really hard to change.
Can you say a word about that? Because in your article, you do lay it out very clearly, everything from taxation to the way the local governments finance themselves. So like because you're right, Beijing now also sees it. It calls it involution in its own vocabulary. Obviously doesn't call it overcapacity, but they are concerned about the deflationary pressures and the price wars, and they do want to address it. And you argue that it's very difficult for them to do so. And so maybe in a nutshell, if you could say why it's not going to work.
Great. So in a nutshell, it's because the subnational players' incentives are wired in a way that are interlocking and reinforcing. I just name three of them. First, local governments. Well, local governments don't care about U.S.-China relations. They care about
We're familiar with the subnational issues.
Right. Well, they care about whether they can get promoted. How do you get promoted? Well, there's KPI, by the way, and that KPI is called GDP. They need GDP growth. How do you drive GDP growth? Well, let's take a look at our balance sheet. I need tax revenue, right? China's tax system is VAT, value added tax. Local governments get tax every step along production. So that's value added, right? So production, you source material, then intermediate steps and final goods. Every step of that production process of that supply chain, vertical supply chain, local governments take a cut if that step is in that jurisdiction. So they have incentive to build entire supply chains in their jurisdiction to juice every dollar of tax revenue along the way. So once Beijing says, oh, let's all do EV. EV is high strategic area for them. They just built, just carbon copies of the same EV supply chains across China, and they compete to basically bribe suppliers to relocate to their jurisdictions. So, Hefei's model is successful. Can every city in China become so Hefei? And when you get like millions of Hefei in China, you get overcapacity. That's as simple as that. So that's local government. And then financial sector. China's capital market finance banks dominated. Capital market, not quite there. China's bank, state-led, state-dominated. They are very risk averse. They have their own incentives. If I register a loss on my bank balance sheet, well, that's going to look pretty bad for me. So if I know there's overcapacity, if I know those factories are never going to make money, do I just write it off? No. I keep supplying the bloodline of finance to keep them going so they do not register at loss on my balance sheet. So that's why you have also zombie supply chains, zombie EV firms across the board. Oh, by the way, how do banks decide who to lend to? They want to have something visible. They want to have some hard assets, collaterals, factories, supply chains, right? Because, if something goes bad for you, then I can also claim that asset. If you tell me you're a brilliant biotech entrepreneur, you want to do 0 to 1 innovation, by the way, China wants that kind of innovation. Who am I to tell you're not just, making this all up, right? So they support those hard asset, hard collateral build out. That's called factories. That's overcapacity. And finally, critically, if you look at the incentive for China's private entrepreneurs, well, how do I decide which product to produce? I look at policy support. What's high priority for Beijing? I need to be politically aligned with Beijing. Well, they say EV is high priority. There's a lot of policy support, so let's do EV. But here's the thing. We're all doing the same thing. How do you actually make money in China? You grab a larger share of the market, right? How do you grab a larger share of the market? I cut my price. And now everybody's cutting their prices. Those firms are extremely competitive, right? If you have a product, I can do the same product within 5 minutes. That's quite literally what's happening on Taobao. You have a new design? Well, my competitor have the same design, priced as 0.5 yuan, slightly lower than mine, within 30 minutes.
That's literal price wars, yes.
That's the evolution price war. And well, every firm is doing that. Yeah. Well, you get a lot of products. You have very low price. No one is making profit. So how do they do? Well, lots of product, no one domestically absorbing that demand. I have to put it somewhere. That's That's overcapacity.
And that's obviously then becomes the export-driven growth as well. So I think that's a fabulous summary of it. And again, we can look into that issue and spend the next hour just talking about that. But I do want to hit on your final shift that you mentioned in terms of how Beijing is strategically now using overdependence and the dominant position that it has created in supply chains. We obviously saw that with rare earth, but we saw that in many other sectors as well, and likely to see it in others. You certainly mentioned pharmaceuticals. We'll see how that, and biotech in general. But if I could also then link it to what this means for middle powers, as you mentioned, I loved your framing that Canada is a bit of a thought experiment and thought experiment pilot and a potential example. So I hope that we do graduate into being a potential example rather than a bad thought experiment. But it is all happening in real time, and to the extent that you can provide some kind of advice or guidance, or even help us think through how we can manage, knowing all of these things that you've laid out around China's own strategy for its economy, for its technology, and for its industrial strategy. How do we engage, because we do want to engage and benefit from deeper economic partnership? How do we compete in areas where we need to compete? And how do we restrain the areas which are too sensitive for reasons of national security and economic security? What does it actually look like today, right? Is China's evolving its industrial strategy? So you talked about industrial strategy 2.0. What should the new kind of recalibrated China policies for middle powers like Canada look like? Or at least what should guide them? Because it would be difficult for you to be too prescriptive, but what would be some elements that you would say a policymaker should keep in mind?
Great question. So let me just first channel my inner Chinese here. I think when you have, face a menu of choices, the default choice is to do the most challenging and the hardest thing. I talk like an Asian parent now, but never choose the easy route.
Never journalism.
吃苦, right? Eat the bitterness. I think that's precisely what we need to do. First, do not, the era of we can outsource our China strategy to Washington is over. I hope that lesson is abundantly clear.
I think we got that part. So
Okay,
you'd be
great.
happy to know. I think Canada's
Fantastic.
clear. We need a made in Canada China strategy.
Fantastic. And second, that comes to the challenge and complexity part. I think we need to embrace our lack of real China knowledge, to be quite honest. Well, first, we need to learn ourselves a little better. We need to define our own strategic priorities more clearly. The thing is, you cannot protect anything, you cannot tariff anything, everything. You cannot subsidize everything, you cannot securitize everything. The question should be, where does China need domestic capacity? Where does China need allied capacity? Because dependence on China would create those unacceptable vulnerabilities. For example, critical mineral, critical AI infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. But also where, we can actually leverage China. For example, when it comes to overcapacity, can we try to leverage China's overcapacity? By the way, this is also something that China is very worried about. To lower consumer prices in key products, to speed up our own green transition. How do we carve out those guardrails, those express lanes to speed ourselves up? And where should we actually collaborate with China more? For example, China's cost-effective cancer therapies. Well, I come from a country who has a extremely inequitable and grossly, ridiculously expensive health system. I think that's actually the number one question for the future of the United States. And then we need to embrace complexity of China. Where is China our market? Where is China our competitor? Where is China our supplier? Where we should think of China as an innovator? And where should we think of China as a security challenge? I think there are quite a few nuances to unpack there. And if our debate collapses all China into one category, that's the easy answer, but that's also the wrong answer, the default answer. A good strategy requires segmentation. There are things where, there are areas where China's scale is actually highly useful. There are areas where China competition is healthy. There are areas where Chinese investment should definitely be scrutinized. And there are areas where our dependence on China should be reduced. or even eliminated. And those are not the same policy problem, by the way. And finally, I think it's critical, if there's one thing or one, I would say, hard-earned lesson we should take away from the United States, I think we should preserve critical channel of knowledge on China. I think one of the risks in today's immigration environment in the United States is that China expertise itself becomes very securitized. If we really want to understand China, if we just securitize China knowledge as a byproduct of it, we do not become safer. Our Chinese policies become more polarized and more reactive and more wrong. I think we need more language expertise. We need deep sectoral knowledge into China. We need more subnational level of understanding of China. And we need more conversations with industry stakeholders in China. Not all of them is a communist spy company. Not everyone who speaks fluent Chinese is beholden to the party state. And not every Chinese student studying in our country is a potential strategic liability. I think preserving those critical channels of knowledge is the number one surefire way for a better China strategy. So yeah, so that's how it should be.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lizzie. I think we would all agree that it's the era of simple answers of engage or not engage, compete or confront or cooperate. Those are no longer sufficient, and we need to get much more granular and much more sectoral and differentiated as we look at specific sectors where we can do things and where we cannot. So, and that requires so much capacity and know-how in government, so much partnership with industry, and so much continuous knowledge and updating of our own assumptions and understanding of China. And so people like yourself who are able to translate and make sense of China inside out to audiences like this in the West, I think are really invaluable. So we thank you so much for starting this morning's conversation, for both your presentation and also for answering some of these questions. I'm sure we'll try to come up to some of these themes as we move to the other two panels. So, but for now, please join me in thanking Lizzie for that wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And thank you for being so patient. So I think we'll just seamlessly transition. So Lizzie, if I could ask you to go back down into the audience, and I'll invite our three panelists to please join me on stage. Thank you, Lizzie. So I will invite the first panel. So Dan Churiak, Kati, and I think we're still missing Danielle. Okay. Yeah. So it's unfortunate she had a medical emergency. We hope she's okay, but we will be proceeding with our other three panelists. Click.
There's a clicker, green button to go forward, and orange to go back. Just like the first.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for managing that seamless transition with us. So we're coming to you for our first panel, which will be looking at what all of this means for Canada in this context, looking specifically at technology, trade, and supply chains. We have three amazing panelists, two of whom are our John McArthur Fellows, and Dan Churiak. Oh, Danielle made it. Okay. Wonderful. Well, we had thought that maybe we missed. Fantastic. Great. All right. Now we're all here. The panel is complete. Fantastic. Okay, so let me begin by introducing Danielle Goldfarb, who just joined us. And she will be looking at how AI is reshaping trade and what this means for Canada. She's a leading expert on the digital economy, real-time data, geopolitics, trade, and public policy. She's a distinguished fellow with Asia-Pacific Foundation, as well as one of this year's John McArthur Fellows. She's also a senior fellow at CG in Waterloo and co-directs the Canada Artificial Intelligence Adoptive Initiative. Then we're joined by Kati, who, as I mentioned already, has traveled from California. She will discuss the types of AI-related and digital trade policies Canada should be promoting in the Indo-Pacific to support its diversification strategy. And Kati is the founder and CEO of Next Trade Group, and has built numerous initiatives and public-private partnerships. She advises both governments and private sector actors. We have Dan Churiak, who is quite familiar to most folks here in the room. He's also a distinguished fellow with APFC, but also had a long career in government, including as the Deputy Chief Economist of the Department of Global Affairs Canada, and is now also a fellow with CG. And then last but not least, we have Ari Van Assche, who's a professor of international business in the HEC Montreal and co-director of the International Institute of Economic Diplomacy, and also this year's John McArthur Fellows. So we're absolutely thrilled to have all of you. Thank you so much for working with us throughout the year for all of the writings, all of which will be available on our website. We've had already a full hour of conversation, and if there are themes that you want to weave in, please feel free to do so. But Danielle, why don't I start with you for your opening?
Use this?
Yes, please.
Okay. Good morning. I spent a lot of time studying trade, like everyone else on this panel, but I'm going to start with a little story, because a few years ago I stopped studying trade and I actually became an exporter myself, or was part of a small company. It was actually just a few blocks from here, and it was above a store, tiny 10-person company, and the company was what you call a micro multinational. So it was this teeny tiny company, really exporting around the world, everywhere from DC to London to Hong Kong. And so what were we selling? We were actually selling real-time data. So it was a digital service. And what we were doing is we would create a unique data feed, and then we would sell that data feed over and over and over again at zero marginal cost. We didn't have any location in these countries. We didn't have to add to our headcount to sell an additional data feed, and no shipping costs, et cetera. So, and the other thing is that we were not an exception. Once I started working at this company, I would see like data feeds everywhere around me, literally like I was dreaming about data feeds. But so the point is that this was not an exception. There are many of these kinds of companies out there, but when we talk about trade in this country, we're really focused on physical goods. And as Trump, over the last year and a half, our conversation about physical goods has been even more intensified. And yet the fastest growing part of global trade now is not steel or autos or oil. It's actually digital services. And so the service I talked about is part of the fastest growing import in the world. It's the fastest growing set of imports in every region of the world, and it's the fastest growing part of Canadian trade as well. And there's many importers in the Asia-Pacific, including countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and India are some of the fastest growing markets for digital services imports. And so the most valuable parts of trade today are data, software, algorithms that are either sold on their own or embedded into products. And so that's what I just wanted to give that example as an example of how trade is changing. It's changing who can trade, it's changing what we can trade, and it's changing where value is created in the world in terms of global trade. So the internet reduced the cost of trading for both goods and for services because it allowed firms to sell digitally. It allows them to collaborate across borders. And it quickly gained market intelligence, right? So we could, you can Google and figure out what's going on in these countries. And it disrupted these traditional assumptions we have about trade, that proximity is the most important, proximity drives trade, that gravity drives trade, that we have to sell into the US market. And that small companies cannot scale quickly, they have to add to their headcount. So really these traditional assumptions, I think, are no longer, not necessarily the case for all businesses. And so now the data feeds I talked about actually are kind of ancient history. They started about 10 years ago. And so this has been going on for a long time. I just think our trade conversation has not really recognized them. But there's been some major changes in the last couple of years, and the main one is that we're we're moving from artificial intelligence that can kind of deal with one narrow task to general purpose AI over the last couple of years, where there's been really stunning advances in capabilities related to general purpose AI. So the idea is that general purpose AI can be applied to any task across any domain. And this, again, sort of expands the possibilities of what is possible. The first, I think, major implication is that the cost of trading has now dramatically declined. And so, the World Trade Organization and other organizations are saying that global trade is going to expand quite a bit because of these changes and because of the rapid growth in AI. And so, again, they sort of accelerate what the internet and digitization did, and they really dramatically lower costs, both for goods and for services. And the main thing is that anyone, anywhere, can access these gains in terms of AI advances. You don't have to have you don't have to be technically sophisticated to use a lot of these tools, and you don't have to necessarily have a large company size. But there's tons of these companies, small little companies, just even around these couple blocks around here that are kind of doing a lot of this stuff. And so you can coordinate and collaborate across countries. You can actually, we now have instant translation. It's very, which is actually pretty good across most languages, not all. And you can really understand, you can get market intelligence much more quickly and better market intelligence. And really understand the regulatory environment, all the kinds of things that you need to do as as an expert of any size, but you can really get this information, it can be synthesized much more quickly with these advances in AI. So, Kati, I don't know if you invented this term, the menu of tradables. Did you invent that term? Well, I thought Kati did, okay? I heard it from her first. Yeah. Oh, you invented it? Okay. Well, she invented this. Okay, she takes credit for it. She deserves to take credit for it. This idea that we have a menu of tradables, and we first started with only being able to trade physical goods, then services, then digital services, and now we have this whole new category of AI-enabled services. There's very different levels of it, but to make a long story short, we sort of have AI-enabled services, which kind of continuously learn and adapt. And it can synthesize and really I don't want to use the word understand, but understand in quotes, any data that we feed them at a scale and quality and depth that was really impossible before. So an example could be climate monitoring that makes sense of continuous satellite and sensor data combined with other data and does this at a scale and quality that was just not possible even a few years ago. And then we have entirely new tradable services that only exist because AI exists. So the examples of this would be services like the creation of synthetic data. Again, there's a company right near here that does, has a really, really much better best-of-class AI detection tool that it's selling around the world to universities around the world and other, other organizations, HR people around the world. Another example would be red teaming, which is trying to poke holes in AI systems. So these are all examples of newly tradable services that didn't exist before AI existed. And I think, the important thing is we're seeing stunning and rapid advances in general purpose AI, and as those capabilities increase, we're going to see new types of services. And I think you're going to talk about AI agents, but really things like emerging autonomous services where humans set the goal and then AI agents figure out how to execute. And we will even see this in the trade area where we have autonomous trade execution. So these are examples that are on the horizon, in many cases already starting to appear. The last point I'll make about that is that it's not about technology companies. This applies across every sector. So when we think about global value chains in general, they're constantly generating tons of data, whether it's the auto sector or the agricultural sector. And with each movement, each interaction is a data point. And these tools, the new tools, the AI tools, can now synthesize this information and really adapt decisions and actions in real time. So this is a big change. Now, I guess I'll just briefly talk about implications for Canada. The most important one, I think, that is maybe so sort of obvious is that we now have a way to sort of meaningfully expand our exports outside of the United States. So Mark Carney has said our goal is to double non-US exports. Many prime ministers before him have tried this and failed, largely failed at many points throughout our country's history. But trade is really different today, and it looks very different. And so these dramatic decreases in trade costs mean that proximity matters less. So we always had this assumption that gravity drove our trade, but for much they don't. In many cases, proximity may not matter at all. And so that's the first implication. I think the second is that it's not just about geographic diversification. We want to de-risk and we want to make sure we're resilient. We need to think about different kinds of things we can trade and where the value is created in a global value chain, and where it's what's going to represent the most value in global trade. So by trading in various different kinds of trade, again with this expanding menu of tradables, we are going to be able to kind of hedge our overall trade portfolio. So we're de-risking our overall trade portfolio, and so the next time Trump, does whatever crazy thing he's going to do with tariffs, we have lots of other different kinds of things we trade that face different obstacles and different challenges. So we're really trying to. It's a good way to de-risk our overall portfolio. And yeah, so I think in this case, I would just sum up by saying that, we really need to think about where our comparative advantage is going to be in this new paradigm, and how do we tap into these higher value tradables. And so, where can we best nurture the kinds of exports that are going to have this higher value? And I think that the businesses in countries that do figure out how to do that and export these sort of data and intelligence layers, either on their own or as part of global value chains, are going to be capturing this higher value part of global trade, and once it's captured, it's very difficult to displace these kinds of firms. So how do we develop? How do we kind of nurture that kind of activity is a key question, I think, for this country. And I think we also need to educate and support and figure out how to nurture, sort of how to make changes throughout this sort of trade support supply chain, or sort of the whole chain of activities we do around trade. Everything from modernizing our trade agreements to modernizing the trade support we give companies, whether it's through the Trade Commissioner Service or funding for AI-enabled startups, which we don't give that much to. And so, for example, if you go to the Trade Commissioner Service, which I did as this small company, and I tried to get support, there was no category for the type of work that I did. And so we kind of got lost in the whole Trade Commissioner Service. And this is not a criticism of the Trade Commissioner Service. It's really a criticism of how we set up everything in these sort of sectors that are not necessarily, or these kind of narrow framework or category that's not really as relevant now as it might have been 10 or 20 years ago. So I think throughout all those kinds of things, we need to think differently, and I think we also need to think differently about applying AI to our whole supply chain. And we have trade statistics that are sort of they're fine. They're lagging reality, but they're okay. But in the rest of the world, they're moving to greater supply chain visibility and applying a lot of these tools to really have a better understanding of how to deal with trade disruptions, how to deal with a whole bunch of other things that I think that Canada is really behind its peers in terms of really using these tools to develop better intelligence and visibility into what we are trading with the whole world. So those are a couple ideas, and I think that we're having two different conversations in this country, one about trade and one about AI. And I think that we need to have a conversation about how these advances in AI are impacting trade, and what this means for our country. This is not a marginal change. This is a disruption to how trade takes place, and I think we need to kind of figure out where Canada can succeed in this new paradigm. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Danielle. That's a great way to kick off this particular discussion and we've really appreciated your thought leadership over the last several years, in fact, on this issue of really thinking differently about trade, not just looking at trade in goods, which dominates so much of our conversation, because until recently, a lot of our exports have been, particularly in commodities and energy, and now the conversation is about how do we build additional infrastructure through billions of dollars and multi-year projects to be able to get those products to market, but you are suggesting that we should be also looking at diversification from a perspective of what it is that we're actually trading in, and really taking advantage of the disruptions that AI is offering and the opportunities that now exist, and that this is not just an incremental change, but this is a fundamental reshaping of that. So I think there's much there to unpack, including your point around how do we change the ecosystem that exists to enable that trade diversification and the Canadian participation in the global economy, as you, not just the trade services from the government, but also everything that happens at the provincial level, all the there's a menu of organizations that are there to support trade, but as you said, they haven't fully adopted their tools. So there's much to unpack, and I hope we'll come into that conversation. And that idea that we're not going to be limited by geography, I think can be really exciting because, as you pointed out, a lot of Canadians, leaders have spoken about diversification, but we can't escape our geography. So, but maybe AI can help. Kati, continuing on, because so much of your work is actually linked to this as well, and so I'll give the floor straight to you, and then I think you have some slides?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Vina, and thank you for having me. Really an honor to be among the fellows here, and great to be in Canada. So I've been working on this concept of what is trade in AI, and this is of course relevant for Canada for the reasons that Danielle just mentioned, as well as for the reason that you have fantastic AI startups, AI researchers, AI-enabled companies across the spectrum, as you mentioned, in manufacturing, mining, also businesses are starting to leverage AI. And furthermore, then in Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific region, the demand for these kinds of AI-driven services is exploding, growing very rapidly. And furthermore, many countries in the region are thinking about AI regulations and AI laws. So the regulatory frameworks are also in flux beyond just the trading services frameworks that exist. So I was trying to get a sense of, well, what is this trade in AI? And perhaps we can think of it kind of three ways, or three kinds of companies. One is these kinds of AI-driven startups like Cohere or Ada that are here just in the neighborhood that are working on generative AI solutions for healthcare, for instance, or on agents for customer service for different kinds of companies. These kinds of very AI-driven businesses whose value proposition is AI. Then you have these kind of AI enabling services, if you want, like let's say cloud computing or data center services and so forth that enable these AI startups. And finally, you have the large swath of Canadian companies that are the AI-enabled businesses across the spectrum, whether they are in financial services or manufacturing or mining and so forth. So actually did a little bit of, let's see. I don't think our clicker is.
Is it not working?
Am I pointing the right place?
Technology,
So-
can't rely on it.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah, so this may be helpful just to see what Danielle was talking about, how rapidly the AI-enabled services in particular are growing compared to, say, mining or manufacturing in Canada's export. So at the bottom, you have the export growth over the past 10 years annually, and you can see that the darker bubbles, which are the kind of more AI-enabled, i.e., or more AI-intensive services, are growing very rapidly, 10 to 15% growth rate year on year, compared to, say, mining or manufacturing that are very large industries but growing more slowly. And also the global market share of Canadian AI-enabled industries is growing. And altogether, these just 5 AI-enabled services here, information services, research, computer services, financial services, professional services, make up about 10% of Canada's exports. So it's a small but rapidly growing share of Canada's trade. Also, if we look at the firm level, SMEs that are investing a lot in AI, that are becoming more AI-enabled, are becoming likelier to export, controlling for other things that contribute to firms' kind of export participation and intensity. So it seems that there's something going on between AI adoption becoming more AI-intensive at the sector level and at the firm level, and then participating in the actual trade. So as Danielle mentioned, Canada's trade in these AI-enabled industries is still heavily to the United States, not as much as in goods, but it is. At the same time, the Indo-Pacific region is growing. It's probably about 7% of the total. There's a lot of room to grow. The AI demand for AI services is growing very rapidly. So what I'm trying to get at in this second paper that I'm doing in the series is, well, what does the trade landscape look like for these AI-driven services or AI-enabled services that Canada exports or has potential to export? What is it that we should be solving for, and how should we think about kind of trade policy in the era of AI and unlock markets in the Indo-Pacific region for Canada's exporters? So one way to think about it is, there's probably three ways, perhaps more ways, to think about it is, well, what are the barriers for trading services? Because a lot of the AI-intensive industries are indeed services companies. So they may be in legal services or financial services or professional services. They just happen to leverage AI to augment their services. And there is very useful databases from the World Bank that seek to show what is the restrictiveness of services, basically in different markets in the Asia-Pacific. So here I'm seeking to show, on a scale from 0 to 100, 100 being the most restrictive, how restrictive are these markets for Canadian AI-enabled services? And as you can see, we have Indonesia, India, Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand that are quite restrictive at the multilateral level. The first bar is kind of the GATS commitments that these countries have made, i.e. the maximum restrictiveness. But at the same time, what we see in many of these countries is that the commitment made at the regional level, i.e. in the CPTPP, is actually driving down the restrictiveness. In other words, CPTPP is helping Canada, it's kind of WTO plus, is really helping Canada to deepen market access for AI-enabled services in many markets, including in the difficult market of Vietnam, but particularly Australia, Japan, and Malaysia. Then if we look at sectorally, and these are the sectors that could be kind of matched with trade data to your Canada statistical data on which sectors are most AI intensive, we see kind of similar patterns, right? Some sectors, legal services, professional services, financial services, are very restrictive, very difficult to supply markets, even from within, but certainly also across borders. However, computer services, which are mostly the kind of AI startups where they would be classified, are quite liberalized in the region, which is good news. And then again, we see that the CPTPP, the regional, the dark blue bar, is kind of lower. So in all these different services, Canada's participation in CPTPP is really delivering kind of liberalization gains, if you like. So CPTPP could be a good place to build on. Another way maybe to think about, well, how liberalized is the trading landscape for Canada's AI-enabled services, is to think of like cross-sectoral trade policies or digital trade policies, like data transfer, data localization, source code protection, cybersecurity protection, consumer regulations, and of course CPTPP addresses these in another chapter, the e-commerce chapter. And so we actually sought to get a handle of, well, how well do CPTPP partners comply with these different regulations in the e-commerce chapter. We did this paper a couple of times with CSIS, and we discovered that by and large, the compliance is rather good for the partners like Australia or Chile, Japan. Canada itself does very well complying with the CPTPP. But again, we have some problematic countries like Brunei and Vietnam where compliance is not that great. There's a lot of data localization issues in Vietnam. And of course, beyond the CPTPP countries. So Vietnam has, some of you may know this much better than I do, but new laws also regulating data transfer. There have been laws in the past 6 years or so, or 8 years or so, that limit the transfer of data. So you really have to localize your operations in Vietnam to be able to service the market. But there are other Asia-Pacific countries like Indonesia, India, that are not part of the CPTPP that have these kinds of restrictions to the movement of data. And this is, of course, very complicated for AI companies then, because they really feed off the data and also for cross-border supply of all these digital services that Danielle was mentioning. So there are some barriers if we think of kind of AI-enabled services as a digital service as well. And then the third way maybe to think about it is, well, there are these new laws and legal frameworks specific to AI emerging in the region. I'm sure there's fierce debate in Canada on what you should be doing as well on this. But we have different models emerging in the Asia Pacific. So one is the kind of Japanese model, which is hailed by the industry as very flexible, pro-innovation, kind of public-private partnership model. Not really almost a law, but more like a flexible guidelines and pro-innovation model. There are a lot of countries with kind of principles, guidelines, countries that have not really embraced a law or regulation yet, but are thinking about what to prescribe. And then there are a couple of countries, Korea and Vietnam, that have issued AI laws that are very similar to the European law. And there are some restrictions also that would be pertinent to Canada's AI companies, like Vietnam's AI law that just was passed, makes the high-risk system providers, the high-risk AI system providers, subject to conformity assessments. They must have a commercial presence or authorized representative in Vietnam, and they will be subject to periodic audits. And to my knowledge, it's quite unclear who is in the high-risk category, right? So if you have these kinds of requirements, then of course you have higher fixed costs to enter markets, because you would have to enter probably the market, and just operational costs. So those are probably the three things to watch when we think about kind of how liberalized, what is the trade landscape for Canadian AI-driven companies that are really, AI in their core value proposition, or AI-enabled services, whether it's legal services that are augmented by AI, or professional services. Here are a couple of thoughts on the policies that we could drive. So the first is ensuring the CPTPP implementation. We have a lot of these digital trade agreements and e-commerce chapters in Asia-Pacific region in particular, but they are not really well monitored, or their implementation is not really examined even by the peers. So there's a lot of room for improving the implementation and monitoring of the implementation in the CPTPP. That's like point one. Then there is opportunity to evolve CPTPP, of course, to include some of these AI provisions. You have done a lot of work at Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, Dan, absolutely, on exactly this. And so there's a couple of ideas I have here. Why don't we promote, for instance, copyright exceptions so that AI-driven companies can use kind of copyrighted content, a little bit like the Canada's fair dealing policy. Could we embrace something like that in the CPTPP? Promote AI standards, as are promoted by some digital trade agreements already, like Singapore, Australia, Singapore, Korea have MOUs around AI in their respective digital economy agreements that kind of champion the adoption of common standards. Should be pretty low-hanging fruit. Of course, open government data is another important policy, so that governments make their data machine-readable, user-friendly for AI companies, including Canadian companies, then to use that data and develop new services. And then, the governance should be risk-based, so that not, the kind of low-risk AI companies are not regulated the same way as the higher-risk companies. Perhaps there's an opportunity to work on guidelines also on agentic commerce. Like, this is really moving very fast. The agentic revolution, agentic payments, agentic commerce transactions are really moving very quickly, and some countries like Singapore have already issued very enlightened guidelines on agentic commerce. I think Canada has approached this with US, New Zealand, Australia, more from the perspective of, well, what are the cybersecurity implications, like your Center for Cybersecurity has issued some guidelines together with other partners on this area. But there's opportunity to take the approach that Singapore has taken, perhaps with trading partners, and start to think about the framework. How do we think of agentic commerce? How do we unlock that opportunity for SMEs, but also then, of course, mitigate the risks? There is possibility, of course, to think about kind of government procurement as well. A lot of these AI companies that Canada has could supply governments in the region, but many governments in the region are not part of the WTO government procurement agreement. So perhaps something like that could also be baked into the CPTPP. There is government procurement language there, but it could be more specific to digital services. And then finally, my understanding is that Canada is at some stage of concluding a trade agreement with ASEAN. Yes. So there is opportunity, of course, to embrace this agenda there and the digital trade agenda in general. So I'll finish there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kati. And it builds really nicely on what Danielle was mentioning and sort of looking at barriers to technology and AI-enabled trade, particularly looking at services trade. And I really appreciated you bringing in the CPTPP, sort of what has been the value and an impact already, but also what more can be done in that area. And the idea that Canada can be learning from what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, particularly some of the innovations of countries like Singapore and the various digital trade services agreements, as well as agentic commerce, which I hope we will unpack a little bit in terms of what that actually means and what Canada should be watching for in the region. I noted that in your slide, in terms of the different AI frameworks, you didn't have China there, and that's, I mean, we can unpack for what reasons and where would you put that sort of in the Japan, and then the kind of the three categories of green, yellow, red, I suppose, where would China's frameworks fit and what that means for our engagement. And then finally, your point around modernizing the CPTPP and obviously also making sure that its e-commerce chapter 15 is fit for purpose is really well taken. It's something that leads us nicely into also bringing Dan into this conversation, who can kind of go into many directions. So I'll be actually curious to see where you will go, Dan, because you've done a lot of work on looking at Canada's trade agreements, how well we utilize them, looking at CPTPP right now, and also obviously around the current debate in the moment. So I'll turn to you and see where you take us in the conversation, but you can tease out a number of these trends.
Okay, thank you very much, Vina. I do have some slides. I'm not sure if it's up and running. Here we go. Yeah, so that was the title that was chosen for me, so I take no responsibility for that.
It's like op-ed titles, right?
Exactly. But Lizzie was talking about the Canadian experiment in terms of where we are in terms of dealing with this rupture. And I would summarize it basically on this basis that we want to preserve as much as possible of the old order, and this includes the multi-party agreement at the WTO for dispute settlement. We're talking about this middle power bridge, EU CPTPP, basically keep as much going as possible while this rupture unfolds. We want to double trade, as Danielle pointed out, with non-US, and my point would be simply that U.S. policy will ensure that that happens. The reason why, as long as the U.S. was open to trade, there was no point for us to double. When the U.S. puts up large barriers, that will happen very naturally. And you saw what happened with China's trade with the U.S. when 35% tariffs went up. After a few years, it plummeted as supply chains rearranged. So that's going to happen. We want to strengthen diplomatic ties with our traditional partners who hedge against the United States. That's the EU and the UK, and Carney was just at the European Political Community Summit in Yerevan. We want to exit from the U.S.-China trade war, and we did that very nicely with the removal of the WTO illegal tariffs on Chinese EVs, and China withdrew their blockage on canola, which is much more important to us because we still haven't produced a single EV as far as I know, commercial EV in Canada, notwithstanding the policy. And we've joined the bandwagon on industrial policy with the Canada Strong Fund and the defense tech spending, though I'm not sure that there's a real understanding of what industrial policy should be doing in this world, but we're certainly jumping on the bandwagon. We're talking the talk. And we are entering into good faith negotiations on CUSMA renewal, and we've heard from pretty much all of Canadian leaders, from Mark Wiseman, our ambassador to Washington, and others, that this is the way we're approaching it. We're going to be good faith, but not making upfront commitments to sort of get out in front of this, because we really don't know what the value of the counter signature is from Mr. Trump. So that's kind of where we are. And then what the modeling says about where we are, the impact of the U.S. trade restrictions, they are large. It's not just the tariffs, 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, the non-U.S. part of autos, but it's also the fact that now we used to go through the MFN window with no requirement for certificates of origin, and now we do, and that imposed a 3%, 4% perhaps out-of-pocket cost and hassle costs for firms, and that's an added burden. So the burden on our GDP of U.S. protectionism is really quite high. But what the models say, the Bank of Canada's model, which took a 25% tariff on Canadian imports, U.S. imports from Canada and vice versa, we basically lose 1 year's worth of growth. We get to where we would have been in 2029 in terms of GDP in 2030. We don't actually become poorer, we just stall for a year. That's more or less what the models show. There are hiccups, of course, and for some companies it's a lot worse. They get really hammered if the removal of the de minimis, for example, hits companies that were tailored to sell into the U.S. They get put out of business. So it's existential for them, but not for the country as a whole. And all that is before we do countermeasures, and we have lots of countermeasures, and that's where the Canada Strong Fund, the defense deck, the housing, whatever we do on that. And I've written on this in Canada, a trade war, and we have, by my count, 17% of GDP of potential things that we could do to boost the economy. And while they're difficult to do when you are in crisis, that's exactly when you can do those. So we will manage this quite well, I think. But the big issue for us is that the uncertainty bomb has dropped. And if you take a look at the right-hand side in this thing, you'll see that there is this extended period of white underneath the blue line. This is an extended period of uncertainty, and that's bad for investment. For a business, you've got to cover your weighted average cost of capital. On top of that, you need project risk. So if you're 12% on your WACC, you got to get to 20%, say, to cover project risk to get the board to approve. Then you got put on uncertainty on top of that. Now you may be at 30%. And with the acceleration of innovation that we have right now, the time to recoup an investment is shortened. So you're at 40%. So what that is doing is putting capital on the sidelines. Okay, that uncertainty, and that is what the biggest factor affecting our economy at the moment. So we have to figure out how to deal with that in terms of getting our country going, and that may involve something that we're not used to hearing, the fact that you may have to use crown corporations to actually make that investment happen, to de-risk the investment for private sector. So it's kind of where we are. Now, what I really want to talk about is AI not as a general purpose technology, but as a form of capital. Now, if you parse out economic history over the ages, we've gone through 4 periods of different forms of capital being the driving force for the economy. Land, to the machinery of mass production, to the knowledge-based economy when the personal computer dropped, to the age of data. And the age of data, of course, was ushered in by someone working at the University of Toronto, and that was Geoffrey Hinton, with the development of neural nets in 2006. Then came iPhone, was dropped by Apple. That led to the massive amount of data streaming into the cloud. And then the GPUs from NVIDIA were applied to power neural nets at Stanford in 2009, and by 2010, you're in a completely different world. Now, what's important to realize is that literally everything changes. This isn't so much about AI as a regulation of AI per se. It is the fact that it's a new form of capital. Everything will change. to give you a sense of it, when we went from the computer age, okay, from the machine age to the computer age, the industrial towns rusted and the university towns blossomed. The money wasn't going to China. It was going from Syracuse and Rochester and Cleveland and Cincinnati to the colleges. You would drive through Detroit, which is like a war zone, to get to Ann Arbor, which was flowering. Okay, that was the major change. If you think about the spatial organization of society, if you think about skill-biased technological change, which made all of us fairly wealthy, okay, but it also created a new precariat. Everything changed, and that's what we have to be aware of, because we are in a fifth age of capital, machine knowledge capital. What matters to me is the fact that the division of income, national income, will shift. And what you had when we introduced a scalable version of human physical labor, which is the machinery of mass production, okay, we scaled up industry, and now we're introducing a scalable form of human capital or machine knowledge capital, and that will have as momentous impacts on the structure and organization of our society, regardless of how we actually regulate AI. Okay, so that's the key part. Now, in terms of how everything changes, we're just very early into this particular world. But I want you to take a look at that chart, which is the NVIDIA's market cap. Every age has a hockey stick. In the Industrial Revolution, it was GDP. In the knowledge-based economy, it was patenting. In the age of data, it was data. And this one here, NVIDIA's market cap. NVIDIA got fairly wealthy during the data-driven economy, the age of data, to 2022. Got a $280 billion market cap. At the start, it was like less than Fonterra, $8 billion market cap. But after ChatGPT dropped, and you're now into the age of machine knowledge capital, it goes to $5 trillion. It's a different world. Where the data-driven economy was light in capital expenditure, this is heavy in capital expenditure. In human capital terms, where the data-driven economy was heavy in tech jobs, and prompt engineers became kind of a high-paying job, this one is laying off tech. It's a different world. And here is something really, really interesting. This is from Paul Krugman. This is the relationship between the misery index and consumer sentiment. And it was a sort of a linear relationship historically. And then he circles 4 years and calls it the vibe session. But if you take a look at those years, those are precisely the years of machine knowledge capital. Something's happened in the society in terms of how it impacts on consumer sentiment that is not picked up in other kinds of measures. So I assert everything will be different, and we need to somehow figure out how to manage this economy. It's going to be far more important than how we actually regulate AI itself. So Canada through the ages. Canada converged to the US in per capita GDP in the industrial era. We had a mixed record during the knowledge-based era. We actually gained in global GDP share. We rose from 9.7% of the US in 1980 to 10.7 by 2010. But then we shrank in the data-driven economy. We went from 10.7 down to 8.4% of the US in 2022. And what happened? We're going to talk about that. And then since the age of the MK, of machine knowledge capital, we have the erosion has intensified. So we have to figure out how to stop this, and we have to figure out what is the issue. So what happened? The value of data. In the national accounts, there's no value for data per se. Okay, there's databases are measured at the sum of costs, but we still talk in the WTO about electronic transmissions without parsing them out into the digital products that Kati and Danielle were describing, and data. The stuff that's scraped off the web and that is used, monetized in two-sided markets. So we weren't aware that we were losing data, whereas digital products are traded all around. Canada was exporting as well as importing. The flow of data in that sense was almost unidirectional from the open world to the United States. China was the only other economy that managed to develop a data-driven economy of its own superstars because it had the Great Firewall. In this world, barriers don't remove competition. They're the only ones that actually create competition. That's how you stand the world on its head as we moved here. What happened? The US recognized the free flow, the value of data, and they insisted on free flow and no data localization. And we, in the professional trade community, thought these are wonderful things. And we promote that, and in our indexes, we say this promotes growth. It happens that in this particular trade, the basic one is a trade of free internet services for data. In the trade accounts, it's 0 for 0. It's not mentioned anywhere. It doesn't show up at all. But if in the case of how it impacts your wealth, this was beads from Manhattan, and we were the guys getting the beads. Okay? So what happened? In terms of firm structure, sorry, this is kind of big garbled. This is a world of hyperscalers and unicorns. The term unicorn was introduced in 2013 by Eileen Lee to describe something that was rare. It's a different kind of economy run by different forms of finance. Venture capital became much more important. Unicorns were rare in 2013. They're now all over the place. Canada underperformed in unicorns. We have 1.6% of the global unicorns, and we're only about 3% of the size of the US, and we had no hyperscalers. So if you're not participating in this economy, and that's what's driving income, you're doing not so well. What happened? As this era expanded or continued, what we saw was that we were losing companies. Canadian-founded companies increasingly were abroad. And companies are everything in market economy. You might not like this. I'm not talking about capitalism. I'm talking about companies. All GDP is generated inside a firm. All innovation is generated inside a firm. All trade is undertaken by firms, whether they're micro multinationals like Danielle's or my own little micro multinational or very large firms, okay? But it's all in firm. And productivity is a characteristic not of workers, it is a characteristic of firms. You have productive firms, and this is Mark Mallett's and Hedderaj's firms trade theory for those interested. And if you're bleeding out your firms, you're bleeding out productivity, you're bleeding out innovation, you're bleeding out GDP, and you are shrinking. And that's what happened. What happened here, and also industrial structure. In the modern economy, value added is at the front end and the back end of the production process, where you develop products and capture the R&D value and the patents and so forth, and at the back end where you capture branding. Apple is positioned on the two horns of this smile. We, because we bled out the companies that developed those things, we sank to the bottom. And that's reflected in what we call a productivity crisis or a productivity emergency. And Carolyn Rogers says, grab that, break the glass and get that little hammer. I don't know what you do with that hammer, but that's what happened, okay? It's a firm structure problem. What happened? Well, liberalizing FDI, we thought was a good thing, right? I mean, it brings technology into the country and so forth, creates jobs, creates linkages to global markets. But in the innovation economy, what it does is it takes out the right-hand tail of firms. This is a sort of a bell curve that shows the weak companies on the left-hand side, the strong high-growth companies on the right-hand side, and then the big companies, the mediocre middle. FDI takes out the right tail and leaves us the mediocre middle. Again, you see another perspective on why we had a productivity crisis. We just had the mediocre companies left in Canada, okay? And some examples, DNN Research, Jeffrey Hinton's company, acquired by Google in 2013. Maluba, which was led by AI pioneer Yoshua Bengio, acquired in 2017 by Microsoft. Darwin AI, Alexander Wang, the Canadian research chair in AI, acquired by Apple in 2024. Tense Torrent, a Canadian chip firm, relocated to California under VC pressure because we didn't have the financing here. And so we bled out the high growth companies. And then industrial policy. We all grew up in a world where industrial policy meant that you do only horizontal stuff, no verticals, that you don't pick winners and so forth, okay? Now I'm going to tell you a story. Two companies, Hynix and Nortel. Hynix was founded by Hyundai's as a semiconductor company in 1983, I think it was. They failed. They tried standard, static random access memory, failed. They tried dynamic random access memory, failed, kept on by Hyundai. They actually learned by getting some contract work for Intel and others, and actually then started to become a thing until they were bankrupted by the by the semiconductor slump of '96, and then the Asian crisis, and they were forced into a merger with LG Semicon, and that's when Hyundai became Hynix, just in time to be bankrupted by the dot-com crisis. And the Korean state development banks nationalized them by converting debt to equity. And they resisted a takeover by Micron, and then passed Micron in 2 years, and just in time to be bankrupted again by the great financial crisis. So 5 failures. Canada had the world's 8th largest company, Nortel. It was a superstar company. It was also bankrupted by the same crisis that knocked out Hynix. We did nothing. The Chrétien government let it sort of shrivel. They went from 90,000 employees down to 30 and cut down their R&D. They never recovered from that. And they limped along, and they then were again destroyed by the great financial crisis, along with Hynix. And we did. Harper bailed out the auto firms for $13 billion, did nothing for Nortel, and we have a gravestone. If you take a look at the top chart, that is the market cap of Hynix, and it is now $546 billion on 19 April, and we have a tombstone. So that's industrial policy in the innovation age, okay? Whatever you think that you know about industrial policy, I urge you to rethink based upon that particular chart. What happened, okay? We learned how to manage this particular economy, or the economy, during an age when the Caldor facts applied, which is to say you had a competitive market economy, constant share of labor and income, and Tobin's Q not neatly captures this, because Tobin's Q was well below 1 throughout that period, the early 70s through into the early 90s. That's when all our thinking was canalized or set in stone about how, no verticals and stuff like that, no picking winners. There was no point to picking winners if there's no economic rent in the system. And when the Tobin's Q is below 1, Tobin's Q is the ratio of the market value of a company compared to its replacement cost. If the market value is less than 1, there's no point to replacing the company. There's no economic rent in the system, so governments don't care whether you're producing widgets or gidgets. They are happy to let rules dictate. That's when the rules-based system was conceived and structured and emerges. And what happens when you take a look now? Tobin's Q, this is for the United States, for the S&P 500, there are 3 different kinds of way of calculating. It's well above 1. It's actually almost 3 in recent, and we haven't got the tail one, but it's actually soared up, okay? In this world, governments do care about what you're producing. China cares, as Lizzi Lee was saying, about what they produce. That's because there are lots of economic rent at stake. If you're not competing for the economic rent, you are accepting that position at the bottom of the smile curve, which I described, and you are getting mediocre results. So in this world, industrial policy, in the sense of trying to capture the economic rents in the system, is not a choice. It's an obligation to your economy and your citizens. So, are we prepared for the world of machine knowledge capital? We've got assets, we've got natural resources, critical minerals on the ground, we have a skilled workforce, stable institutional framework, we have a charismatic leader with a new majority, right? We're in good shape. But we're bleeding out data, and we're bleeding out companies. We're talking about a sovereign cloud, and we're talking about firm retention, but we don't have the conceptual language yet in play in Canada in our public discourse to actually do that. So I would claim that we are not. And Asia at trade. I finally get to the point of this particular conference.
I was hoping you would.
For that I apologize. So I want to focus on the evolution of China-U.S. competition. China entered the knowledge-based economy in circa 2010. That's when really their knowledge production started off, their investment in that system started off. 30 years behind the United States with a tremendous lag in legacy IP. But they also entered the data-driven economy simultaneously with the U.S., but the U.S. had all the first-mover advantages because the data-driven economy was actually developed in the United States. They caught up by about 2018. In fact, when Huawei got into 5G, took the lead in 5G, that was a Sputnik moment. Paul Bluestein's got a nice story on that in his book on China and the U.S. And that's what starts the tech and trade war. The U.S. actually got spooked. Then you get China enters the era of machine knowledge capital simultaneously with the United States, but with some assets, some advantages. So look at the current situation. The U.S. leads in data centers. It's the first data state. It's amazing the U.S. lead in data centers, actually, if you take a look at the charts. It's also got the leading edge inference and compute, and it's got frontier AI models, unquestioned lead, including now Anthropic's Mythos, which is being restricted by the U.S. government and by Mythos, by Anthropic itself, to only a limited distribution. But China leads in electricity. It's the first emerging electrostate, and this world runs on electricity. And that's needed for inference, and of course it's got the critical minerals, and in a trade war you weaponize what you have, so that's why they're weaponizing the critical minerals. The U.S. is weaponizing leading edge compute and AI frontier models. They weaponize what they have. The world of machine knowledge capital will require state capacity. Because of the huge uncertainty, if you don't have state capacity to invest and do things, you will find the wheels spinning. The parliaments will issue, or prime ministers will issue proclamations, and nothing will happen because the private sector is burdened by the uncertainty. So the public sector will have to engage. So that's advantaged China because they never dismantled their state capacity, even as they built up private sector capacity. But the United States is not only not developing its state capacity, it's dismantling it. This was the Doge thing. And then you've got the U.S. decoupling, which is now really happening, I think, fairly significantly vis-a-vis China. It also amounts to U.S. isolation. There was a famous line from the Brits, fog over the channel, continent cut off. And that was when Britain had the empire on which the sun never set. You can paraphrase that to say, fog over the Pacific, world island cut off. The Americans are thinking of sort of themselves as the world, but they're not. The world has really changed. And then we get into the issue of what could derail things, and here we got the Leader for Life issue, and Fitzgerald and I have got an op-ed which we're trying to flog to some poor publication, possibly Vina, which is that when you have a government, gets personalized sort of power, and when they create so many enemies that they can't afford to leave, and Xi Jinping has purged almost the entire top leadership of the PLA, and Donald Trump was moving to cut off everyone possible in his revenge tour. You've got two leaders that can't afford to leave. And when you've got people in that position, history shows it's very dangerous. So we live in dangerous times, and the one thing that could, I think, really bring down China, I don't worry too much about the excess capacity stuff at all. What I worry about is the fact that China might go off the rails and do something stupid because of personalized power. Canada's positioning, well, we need to have a Sino-Pacific strategy. We've been talking this Indo-Pacific strategy, but that's a leftover from the containment era pushed by the first Trump administration. India can't project force in the West Pacific at all. India has not even joined the knowledge-based economy. If you take a look at their patenting, it's flatlining. Bangalore joined the DDE, but that's one province of India. They don't. The borders are thick. They don't have an internal market, and they've got another one of these leaders for life. So, you know, we should stop thinking in Indo-Pacific terms. It doesn't make any sense. What we're looking at is a Sino-Pacific world that we have to deal with. And the South China Morning Post just had an article talking about how Xi Jinping is no longer going around. They're all coming to him. I think that's where I'll stop.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dan. You did one of the things that is kind of moderator's nightmare. You totally went rogue and took longer than possible, but I'm actually delighted that you did, because it was an extremely thought-provoking. Sorry,
Yeah.
was there another slide?
No, this is just a punchline. The punchline is study history, read science fiction, and hedge.
Okay, well, I didn't want to limit you from your punchline. No, that was great. But as I mentioned, I'm glad actually you did that, because that detour in explaining the world of machine knowledge capital, I think, was really relevant and something that certainly will raise a lot of questions for discussion, and I hope also from fellow panelists. And there were many pieces that I want to pick up on, including your last piece, but in the interest of time, I'm actually going to move on to our final panelist, Ari, to give his presentation, and then I'll immediately open up to all of you to respond to everything you've heard, which has been a lot. So thank you so much for your patience. Ari, the floor is yours.
So thanks a lot for inviting me to be here. It's also a real pleasure to be a John MacArthur Fellow for the Asia Pacific Foundation. So I'll bring the discussion back to economic security after a number of presentations on AI. And the reason is because if you go to Ottawa and you talk to policymakers, economic security is at the center of mind. You go to Washington, D.C., economic security is center of mind. You go to Europe, European Union, same thing over there. You go to Korea, Japan. So economic security really is something that is leading to significant discussions around the world. The reason why economic security has become so important, of course, is because we have suddenly seen that the economic interdependence that for very long was being seen as something that was really good for our economy, something that was considered to be good for economic growth, good for productivity growth, good for stability, good for peace, among many other things. Now suddenly we're finding out that in certain occasions, it may indeed be the case that being overly dependent in a specific sector on a certain country can actually lead to real issues that can affect our economic security. So here I take a picture of Prime Minister Carney, who talked at Davos, who indicated this very clearly. But of course, this is not only something that the Canadians found out, it's something that the G7 already was talking about very clearly in 2023. And for anybody that just that has read the recently come out book called Choke Points by Edward Fishman, it really kind of demonstrates clearly how this is a concern that has been rising a lot in recent years. So if you look at all these economic security discussions, one word that has become very central is choke points. So a choke point is a situation where within a strategic industry, there is one country that has a quasi-monopoly in the production of a critical node that is very difficult to substitute away from. And so if you look at the middle column here, which I cannot see, so what you actually find out is that there's a lot of examples where in recent years you've seen countries weaponize these choke points in order to get a concession from other countries. The one clear example that we're seeing right now is Iran that has blocked the Hormuz Strait, and we see that they've done this in order to try to get a concession from the United States, but there are many other examples like China using export controls on rare earths in order to get concessions, or the United States trying to use secondary sanctions or the foreign direct product rule in order to prevent China to be able to continue building its semiconductor industry. So Of course, all the examples that I just gave of the weaponization of choke points is really where countries on the offensive side are trying to weaponize interdependence for their own purposes. But the moment that one country is weaponizing, there's another country that is looking at that and saying, well, what can we do to protect ourselves better against this? And then suddenly you get kind of the right-hand column here, where you see countries like Canada developing de-risking policies. And I would put Canada's trade diversification strategy in that camp. One can interpret the Indo-Pacific strategy in that camp as well, etc. So in a piece that I wrote for the Asia-Pacific Foundation, what I try to do is reflect on what key principles are that Canada and other countries should be developing policies on as they're thinking about economic security concerns. And I try to do this in a way where we don't end up at the end of the building of the framework throwing out traditional trade policy thinking at the same time. Okay, so and so if you look at the 5 Ps, the first P is actually for me an extremely important one, and the first P is pursue free trade. Oh, it's okay.
Switch places with Dan so you can
see your slides.
Okay. So
Good idea.
Excellent.
So the first one is really that we should be continue to pursue free trade. What I mean with that is, if you look at the economic security concerns, and if you look at choke points, they're not going on in every single sector around the world. The one example I'd like to use is, if you look at the industry of Christmas lights, there's no economic security concerns. Maybe in services, at least when we're thinking about tariffs, I mean, there might not be as many security concerns. So the economic security concerns really are concentrated in a handful of industries that are getting the headline all the time. Semiconductors, biotech, critical minerals are kind of in there as well. But these are really very limited, and these are really the ones that every single country in the world is focusing on. For all the other sectors, in fact, in order to develop further economic security, the best thing to do is trade more. Because if you trade more, then if there is a certain kerfuffle with one country, no problem, you just import the product from another country, economic security issue is gone away. Right, so that's kind of a first one. So what this already means is that when we heard the discussion of Mrs. Lee, the keynote of Mrs. Lee before, where we did hear about real concerns about China, perhaps developing excess capacity that can lead to security concerns. This is not going on in every single industry. We can actually, in a lot of industries, still have more trade liberalization with China as well. This is, of course, not to say that simply kind of increasing trade is going to resolve all the issues. There are certain strategic sectors where we are facing potential choke point situations, and there we can really see a space for industrial policy. So this is really protecting against choke points. This is where we can really try to make sure that we are diversifying where trade is coming from, where we might try to make sure that certain companies are not dominating the entire industry. The third P, and this is maybe the more controversial one of all the 5 Ps, is as we're looking at developing our own economic security, it's not only protecting against or de-risking potential choke points. We actually here in Canada also have important positions in strategic value chains that are important for other countries, and that too can be something that we also can be using in our development of economic security. I'm not saying here that all these strong points that I'm pointing out here are where we are having choke points versus other countries. Sometimes we don't have a choke point, but we can provide an alternative towards for other countries that they find very attractive. So this is something that we probably can also use industrial policy for to strengthen. What am I talking about here? Well, critical minerals is the one that always comes up in the discussions, but I mean, we can also start looking at, R&D in pharmaceuticals. We can start looking at Canada's role in the AI sector. So these are other places where we actually have a lot to offer and that other countries can see as being attractive partners as well. The fourth one, this is kind of the middle power kind of a thing. We cannot develop economic security by ourselves. We need to do this in partnership with other countries. So partnering internationally is really important. This is where Mark Carney in his speech indicated that we should not be building walls around us, but rather try to work with other countries. And the fifth one, which I think is really important, is the choke points of today, or the strong points of today, are not necessarily the choke or strong points of tomorrow. We need to understand where upcoming risks are, where upcoming opportunities are, and what this means is that we need to be able to pinpoint emerging risks better, develop better early warning systems of where certain concerns might be coming out. And so this really requires a collaboration between universities, maybe Stats Canada, and other organizations as well. So if we bring all this together and we look back at the whole discussion about trade diversification, it actually allows us to rethink a number of things we are seeing in the media. So if I kind of would summarize how we have been selling or portraying the trade diversification strategy, it has been to try to grow exports to non-US faster than to US, develop more trade agreements outside of our continent, and then this way we will be seeing maybe at least the risk towards the United States reducing. And of course, Danielle would then kind of say also maybe grow faster services trade because there's less constraints in that as well, right? The moment that you start looking at the 5 Ps and you start putting this onto our thinking about trade diversification, a number of things that will come out that we also should be thinking about. The first one is we shouldn't only be looking at exports. The security concerns are not only on the export side because we are too dependent on the United States. There's a lot of concerns on the import side as well. The moment you put exports and imports together, what it means is we should be doing value chain thinking as we're reflecting on trade diversification. The second one, which is really important, is that developing economic security doesn't mean trying to do everything in every single industry at the same time. One thing that becomes very clear once you start thinking about economic security is that there are certain strategic sectors where we need to do a lot and where industrial policy can be very targeted, and a lot of other industries where actually we don't have to do as much as before. And the third one is, just like we have to be maybe a bit more strategic about industries, we also might want to be thinking a bit more strategically about countries as well. There are certain countries that can do much more to help us develop economic security than others, and we have to be reflecting on that. All this then also means that maybe we should be moving away from counting trade agreements and counting comprehensive trade agreements to maybe reflecting more on how we can have smaller, more strategic agreements that really are focused on dealing with specific choke points in specific industries instead of really trying to cover everything as well. And I do think actually that the Canadian government is quite aware of that. So here's my last slide. This is a cartoon that I took from The Economist of a couple of years ago. Very nice cartoon where we have a very wild, dangerous world with a lot of economic security issues. And you've got Canada with their trade diversification strategy, trying to create some order. The one thing we have to be careful about, though, is that every time, and here's kind of my critique of my own kind of points as well, is every time that we start using industrial policy where we are distorting the markets and where we are favoring certain companies over others, we are contributing a little bit to this chaos that we're seeing. And so as a result of that, as we're thinking about economic security and industrial policy related to economic security, maybe we should be doing this more in collaboration with other countries where there is a confined space for security-guided industrial policy that other countries also agree upon, but we don't have everybody just doing things in a chaotic way. We do need to have some kind of a multilateral system still in place, and we have to think about how to get there. I'll leave it here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ari. This definitely qualifies as a picture says more than 1,000 words. So I think it's absolutely a favorite image. We will try to use it in other events and publications as well. Okay, so we have heard a lot. This panel has been extremely rich. Much has been put on the table. I think, just as a reminder, we are speaking more generally about Canada's economic competitiveness, its diversification strategies, and we're looking at the disruption and the enablement of AI and other technologies, as well as really thinking big picture, as Dan encouraged us, about the world that we're now living in, which is completely different from everything that we were looking at, including all the policies and the tools that we have, free trade agreements, our trade promoting ecosystem, as well as even the way we talk about trade diversification, that itself needs to be reevaluated. And of course, when it comes to state capacity and industrial policy, I think another theme that came out, both in what we heard from Lizzi in the keynote in terms of what China is doing and how China is not stopping, moving forward, and has, in fact, some of the advantages in this current moment because of its state capacity and its industrial policy. What does that then mean for Canadian policymakers, right? So what concretely can we recommend? I know you would want to react to each other's presentations as well, but our audience has been very patient and we have a lot of expertise in the room. So I'm going to open up and collect a few comments or questions. And then we'll do one final round of reflections from the panel on everything that you've heard in the last hour. So with that, there are microphones that can go around, so please identify yourself and do share a short comment or a question, please. And I see Tabriz over there. You were the first hand I saw in the middle there.
Thanks a lot. I must congratulate for putting up such a fantastic panel. My name is Tabriz. I work for Dell Technologies, managing Asian market, except mainland China. But because Taiwan I manage, so mainland China I need to interact a lot. I'm new to Canada, so if I ask some foolish question, please excuse me. I'm only 2 years old here, operating from here. So my question is, looking at US pressure and for Canada to really partner with Asia and other geographies, do you think US will allow us to have very robust engagement with China, particularly, because there will be tremendous pressure, because I spend a lot of time with congressmen and senators and think tank in US and Washington, DC. So I see that. If this is a reality, then what's our strategy to manage? This is one. Second question related is, with Trump, the expectation was that global trade will go down. Actually, it has gone up because others decided to not get away from rule-based order, continue to trade more. So window is closing very fast because countries are engaging in trade. What do you think on the timeline for us to really make a dent and get plugged into GVC, supply chain, tech transfer, and gaining from it? So timeline. Thanks.
Fantastic. Two really great questions. Let's collect a few more. Don't be shy. I know there's a lot of, yep, Jeff, please, in the front.
Dan, you mentioned just in passing that you weren't concerned about Chinese industrial overcapacity. I wonder if you could expand on that just a little bit.
Great. Thank you so much. Anything else? Yep, in the very back there, gentlemen.
A lot of the services trade and a lot of the knowledge management capital you describe, or machine knowledge capital you describe, is dependent upon energy infrastructure and digital infrastructure, much of which we don't have. How do we get there?
Great, fantastic. Any final reflections? Because yeah, here's the lady in the middle. I believe also Vina, which is, yes.
Hi. So just to add on to all the other questions, one of you had described a productivity crisis in Canada and also the outflow of companies. Maybe one of you can elaborate on what's being done to arrest that trend.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much. And that actually connects to the question I had for you, Dan, and maybe I'll start with you in replying and then go to the other panelists. Is, you began your presentation with a nice slide on revealed Canadian policies and then sort of went to in some ways, like upend a lot of that and finished with the idea that we're not really quite prepared for the age where industrial policy and state capacity is needed, and then sort of kind of didn't really end in terms of, so what is to be done? So I guess, and that question also comes to that we have productivity crisis, we have companies leaving, we don't have the infrastructure, including the physical infrastructure, as the gentleman mentioned. So what are we to do and where to prioritize, because we can't do everything. If you were to kind of look at 3 things that should be done, what would those be?
Well, start with the digital infrastructure, okay, and the electricity. Obviously, there's a build-out required. We just missed a whole economic era without doing anything about it. So the basic thing is take one step and then take another step, okay? But we have to start the build, and that would be a very good place for the Canada Strong Fund to focus. In 2019, I wrote a paper for CIGI, which recommended a $150 billion fund, not a $25 billion fund, precisely to do this. We, again, passed on that. In terms of that's kind of the basic thing. In terms of stopping the bleed, okay, we're not even thinking about that. That's the problem. This is when I say we're not prepared for this age. We think in different terms. We don't think of the problems of productivity and innovation as problems of industrial structure. We think of it, Jack Mintz would say it's about taxes. David Crane would say it's about this or that, right? Everyone's got their fix. But it's based upon, if you think about a production function, output is a function of capital, labor, technology. Everyone wants to fix the inputs. They're not thinking about the structure, which is the firm. The firms are the software of the market economy. And if we have all the hardware, as I mentioned, the first slide, but we're bleeding out the software. If you take a computer, to strip out Excel, strip out Word, it does nothing. Okay, that's the problem. So we don't have the language. And this gets kind of to the point about industrial policy. If you think about it as a market distortion, of course it's bad. But if you think about it as in terms of, for example, the risk-return metrics on an innovation or a project, investment project, there are projects which will appeal to the private sector, and we don't have to do anything about that. We don't need industrial policy to do stuff that the private sector will do. But there are other projects that don't have those risk-return metrics. They may have limited appropriability. Stuff leaks out. But public sector loves stuff leaking out. It drives your ecosystem. So there are projects that the public sector should undertake. And there are many investment projects which, if the public sector doesn't execute, that will then prevent further new generations of products. The classic example, of course, is the internet. It was developed by a government program, but the internet was then spawned a whole bunch of private sector entities, which became giants. So if you don't have the public sector doing what the public sector should be doing, which is investing in projects that the private sector is leaving on the table because risk-return metrics don't match their profit bottom lines, but are still socially worthwhile. That's how you do it. In terms of, just to kind of very quickly answer Jeff's, why I don't worry about it, because the overcapacity issue has emerged in the context of a war. The American full-fledged assault on China to try and sort of kneecap them meant that China's economy slowed. As China's economy slowed, they naturally got an increased surplus. You take away the war, when you get declared peace, China's economy will start to revert towards its natural rate of growth, and that will probably absorb most of that excess capacity.
I mean, unfortunately, Lizzie had to step out. I'm sure there will be some other perspective on that because I think that's driven, as her point is, both by external and internal pressures and political economy. But we don't have time to unpack that further, so I'll come to maybe Kati and then Danielle and Ari to respond to either anything that you heard over the last hour that you want to underscore or reflect on, or any of the questions that were raised from the floor.
Oh, sure. Okay. Maybe I'll respond to the question around the productivity crisis and the outflow of companies. There's a lot of reasons, and there are no easy fixes to this. I will just say that, again, as from my field experience, I'll say that we have the age-old issue of the fact that Canadian companies have to go elsewhere before they have to go to other markets before they can sell in the Canadian market. That was my experience. We had to go elsewhere all around the world, and then finally got a contract here in Canada. So I think we need to support our companies a bit more. And then also in terms of funding, it's not necessarily, I talked about how SMEs now can be access all the kinds of things that we formerly thought were related to company size. It's not just all SMEs, but it's really some of these digital startups that are the frontier, the cutting edge, and we really need to support them in better ways than we have. Again, across changing what I call the sort of the whole trade chain and the whole support chain. And I think also, we're having a conversation in this country. It's changing a little bit, but our conversation has been around AI risk and sort of supporting some of these big champions, like you mentioned, Cohere. We're not having as much of a conversation around AI adoption throughout the economy, and I think that's really key to I don't know if it's going to solve our productivity crisis, but we have to put a lot more attention to that in terms of productivity, and that we know is going to lead to more exporting and so on and so forth. So I think that's a part of the conversation that's not getting enough attention. And then in terms of the person who asked about what's the timeline, global trade has gone up instead of gone down, and as Trump predicted, and what does that mean of our timeline to take advantage? There already is so much concentration in a lot of these activities, both across the AI, value chain, all the different parts from chips to compute to models to, et cetera. And so a lot of this, window is closing in a lot of areas because there is such concentration in such a small number of firms and countries. But I think that we do have, a number of areas of strength here in Canada that we can build upon. But the timeline is very, the pace of change is so rapid. And people who've compared the internet to adoption of generative AI and so on can see that the line for generative AI is just going like this, whereas the other ones were much more were significant, but just a slower pace. And capabilities are expanding in a very rapid way. General purpose AI is not just limited to the capabilities of LLMs, but AI agents and many other areas. Just the pace is just stunningly fast. And people who get the advantage now are going to be very difficult to displace.
Thank you so much. Kati?
Yeah, no, just to echo what Danielle was saying, really need to speed up, and I think this research agenda specifically about Indo-Pacific or Sino-Pacific is very much to that effect, that we need to focus on other markets and accelerate the process. And of course, Canada is doing a lot with the ASEAN, with CPTPP. It's much more integrated in many ways to the Asia-Pacific than the United States is. But there is the very significant gap in venture capital in absolute and kind of relative terms, same with US and Europe if you compare the two. So that's one area where I would focus if I were here. And then the other, is perhaps like the constant evolution, as Danielle said. Now we have AI agents. You can have these nano businesses that are run by one person, can be billions of dollars of worth. And this is maybe another type of financing model altogether, another type of kind of, Danny talked about the firm, another type of firm. Maybe the next kind of hockey stick curve is about the rise of these kind of nano businesses. And then we're counting the nano businesses in different economies and to what extent they are growing. And perhaps there's a kind of different model altogether, thinking about the changes in firms as AI agents take over.
Great. Thank you so much. Ari, final word to you.
Thanks. So how can we work together with China? Well, I think that the understanding kind of where the United States sees economic security risks, but also understanding that it is also very sector specific, gives already an understanding of where it could go to. So if we allow for imports, for lots of imports of electrical vehicles, which maybe the United States sees as a strategic sector, it can lead to a reaction by them. But if we're having more trade going on in other sectors that are not considered as strategically important for the United States, I don't think that there will be as much of a reaction by the US. So I think that this is kind of the way to think about it. Just kind of very quickly to what Dan indicated, when I was talking about trade distortion or distortion through industrial policy, what I'm mostly kind of worried about is if we start favoring our domestic firms versus foreign firms from, say, Europe or other allies, they, of course, the other allies don't like that, and they might react to it. And so everything that we need to do for our fourth P, which is partnering internationally, gets a little bit undermined by doing that. So there are trade-offs between the Ps that we have to be thinking about as we're going on. And I mean, it just means you have to be treading very carefully.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful point to end on. I'm not going to try to summarize the rich discussion, but we do have the papers available, and the summary of this conversation will also be available. So I very much encourage everyone to continue to follow the really thought-provoking and groundbreaking work that all of you are doing in this space. And we will now have a much-deserved break for about 15 minutes and come back to the second panel at around 11:45. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you so much.
Listen, what a fantastic, that was really an awesome session that we had this morning. No pressure to the folks next door. What I've told them is that they have a receptive and switched on audience, and I want to get to that right away. And it'll be my pleasure in a moment to introduce the moderator. I spoke a little bit this morning about partnerships and how we really need to all work together to grow the ecosystem in Canada for thought leadership. And I wanted to mention that we have a new program at Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada of corporate and institutional memberships with us. And we have 5 of our corporate and institutional members who are here with us today. Not all of them were in the room when I made my remarks this morning, and I wanted to take the right occasion just to note that this is an arrangement. We provide some bespoke services, but it's a way for those partners also to contribute to the development of the kind of thought leadership that this country really needs, and to help to bring us all together to address the really pressing issues that we face at a time when engagement with the Indo-Pacific region is really in the solution set to so many of our problems. And so I would just like to note that we have with us today from our growing list of new corporate and institutional partners, we have Fasken, Osler, Sun Life, Farm Credit Canada, FCC, and Export Development Canada, EDC, and we're grateful to their support for our ongoing activities. And the other partnership I just want to highlight is that I talked about a little bit about how we do have these bright centers of excellence across Canada, and we are growing our capacity to generate new policy ideas and to think beyond the frontier. And I'm very pleased that we also have a partnership at APF Canada with the Balsillie School of International Affairs. And since 2019, Anne Fitzgerald has been the director there. She's a great partner for us, and it's my pleasure to introduce her to moderate the second session of the day and to thank her for doing that. Anne Fitzgerald.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to Asia-Pacific Foundation and Vina, as ever, for inviting me to moderate this very eminent panel of speakers today. So we are continuing from the themes that were highlighted this morning, but switching gears a little bit to look at that strategic autonomy, dependencies, resilience and supply chains and value chains, as was highlighted today, with a focus on critical minerals. Pascale Massot is an associate professor at University of Ottawa in the Department of Political Studies. She wears a number of different hats, as do all of these eminent speakers. You have their bios. There's more detail located there. But I was privileged to be in Taiwan a few weeks ago with Pascale, and I have to say she is considered the expert she is considered today, even miles away from Canada, in Taiwan, in China, and elsewhere. And so really happy to have you, Pascale. Konstantin Karianopoulos is a real practitioner expert here that has loads of experience from the region and also with Canada's policies and systems and bureaucracies and the whole idea of strategic partnerships. He has some really deep insights on that he's going to share with us. He is retired CEO of Neo Performance Materials and retired chairman of the company, as well as retired chairman of a number of other companies as well. And of course, Professor Philip Lipsey is from here on home turf from the Munk School of Global Affairs itself. And Philip is a professor of political science. He's a chair in Japanese studies. And again, like Pascale and Konstantin, he wears a number of different hats. They are all recognized around the world for their scholarship and practitioner contribution in this area. So it's a fantastic panel. You know, I was thinking, we have big shoes to follow from the first panel, but I know with these experts we can carry on with the depth and insights that have already been shared and build on those. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes maximum, and then we'll carry on with a moderated discussion and invite questions from the floor as well. So without further ado, Pascale, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it has been a pleasure to be a John McArthur Fellow at the Asia-Pacific Foundation for the past 9 months or so. As a fellow, I have worked very hard with Vina, Erin, Karen, and others to launch the Critical Minerals Hub, which you can all go and check out on the APFC website. And we have also launched a podcast called Minerals Matter, which you can listen to on all your favorite platforms as well. So it's been very fun, and I'm very appreciative of that. So today I will concentrate my remarks on the China challenge in critical minerals. But to do that, I want to start by making 2 or 3 broader sets of comments on the current moment that will, I think, build very nicely, complement the panel prior. And then say a few words on the current moment in Canada-China relations, but specifically when it comes to the Prime Minister opening the door to eventual Chinese investment in the EV sector in Canada. Right, so let's get to it. So 2 things I want to say on the current moment in China-West relations. And the first thing is a word that has been creating some hand-wringing in political circles in recent months. I have found this fascinating, and it's the word disruptive. Okay, so China's rise, to me, over the past few decades has been disruptive. Disruptive, a little bit like AI is disruptive. You know, disruptive as in it is changing things. Now, of course, the Chinese have not liked this characterization, which came out in the Indo-Pacific strategy in 2022. And then following Prime Minister Kearney's trip to China in January, journalists were asking the traveling members, you know, whether that moniker still applied. And there was a real discomfort at answering this question at all, actually, if you go back and watch this. And I think 2 things can be true at once, right? China can be a disruptive power because it has risen in a way, because it's a different, you know why. And we can choose to react to that in a variety of ways. And obviously, the current Prime Minister has decided to react to this differently. But I think it's fine to say that China's been disruptive. So what makes it would be hard enough on its own, to rise to that challenge. But the fact that the disruption caused by China's rise is accompanied by a whole host of different disruptions that are arriving at the same time is making this hard to deal with. And what happens is that status quo, progressive, and revisionist positions on all these various disruptions that are happening, which we have covered on the first panel, don't map on evenly. So in other words, a revisionist power in AI or a status quo power on trade or security don't necessarily translate in all orders internationally. So this actually makes Mark Kearney's variable geometry approach actually pretty fruitful, I think, to think about the moment. The second or third thing I want to say more generally about the moment is that, and this builds on previous remarks, is that all great powers have strengths and weaknesses, right? Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. China's no exception. In the case of critical minerals, we're obsessing over Chinese strengths. And yes, they are formidable. But I would point out that despite China's dominance, especially in the midstream and sort of manufacturing sector, it has real vulnerabilities at both extremities of the value chain. So both very upstream most and in terms of export access. And we should think about this more. China depends on imports. Many people don't know that. Almost 100% for its cobalt needs, over 70% for lithium, for copper, for manganese, for nickel, for iron ore, for chromium, right? China doesn't necessarily produce the majority of the resources that it needs. At the other end, we've heard already that China is more than ever dependent on global export markets to absorb its manufacturing outputs. So thinking about these things, right? Disruption, multiple dynamics in different orders, strengths and vulnerabilities, I tried to come up with a way to address this challenge. I've called this, asymmetric resilience, but basically I think we need to go beyond de-risking. And Ari made this point, others made this point, beyond the defensive, reactive posture, right? We should really approach this as a rebalancing of strengths and vulnerabilities towards China, working differently in different issue areas, including with China to balance a range of countries in certain sectors, and balancing against China in other cases. So again, variable geometry. But with an eye to keep an end on, with an eye too. Thank you. To the end objective here, which I would formulate as mutually assured resilience. As opposed to focusing only on our security, if China feels insecure, right, we are not secure. And so basically accepting that China's seeking resource security and resilience too, recognizing that a world where both sides will feel secure will be safer. Broader level, also recognizing that networked and interconnected nature of global supply chains is a factor of resilience, actually, so to Ari's point again. So let me switch gears here and bring it down to the concrete level in the context of Canada-China relations and the EV sector. So 3 points here, I will try to be quick. Building on the theme of strengths and vulnerabilities, I think Canada has more strengths than acknowledged in this context and others. Chinese firms face a unique challenge here in Canada when it comes to thinking about the EV supply chain, the battery supply chain, maybe going all the way up to the upstream most sectors. Canada is not Australia and is not the UK in this context. It has a strong existing automobile industry, the G7 economy that is the most deeply integrated in US supply chains, but also access to upstream, materials. Whether this works or not for China here is not a minor affair. one of China, we could even add, one of China's foremost priorities right now in terms of export access and absorbing excess output. We could even think that at play here in the future of the Canadian battery industry and green tech, supply chain, would be that positioning any participating stakeholders in Canada advantageously, not if but when the US, the largest consumer market in the world, comes back to their senses over the coming years around the necessity to take the green shift, which will happen at some point. So second, I think that, you notice, I'm supposed to be talking about critical minerals. I've been talking about value chains a bit more than about critical minerals. I think that we have to stop thinking about both ends of the value chains. We talk about raw stuff, and we talk about cars. And I think that that's the wrong way to look at it. The whole chain contains many segments, including, value-added segments at the upstream end, where we can think more creatively about China's interacting with China. And a good example that I came across recently is the graphite production area in Quebec, the company Nouveau Monde, who I met one of their managers, and he was telling me he was traveling to Japan often, and it made a lot of sense because Panasonic's an investor. And then he said, well, we go to China often also. And I said, oh, why is that? And he said, well, because Panasonic uses Chinese technology for a lot of what they do, so we go there as well. And I don't think that that's actually a problem, but I don't think that that's present in the way that we think about, the de-risking framework is just so not appropriate to think about that situation. We're actually thinking of Nouveau Monde as solving the China challenge, and it may actually be doing that, but not in the way that we think. And the final point I'll make is that I think, so I happened to participate in a Track 2 dialogue in China in Hefei, Anhui, a couple weeks back. And of course, I detected on the side of the Chinese a change in tone. It's very, very noticeable. What I'm concerned about is that this eagerness does not lead to the glossing over of certain concerns on the Canadian side because of a will to deliver rapidly on the moment. So I would say we cannot rush ahead to cut ribbons and corners, right? We have to do this prudently. On the fact that Canada is not Australia and not the UK, there's another angle, of course, to this in Canada, which is that we have a large amount of people working in the auto sector, which makes it a political and a social issue. So no matter how much we debate the overcapacity involution debate until we drop dead, this needs a political and a social solution. It will not be a solution found on the merits of whether this is overcapacity or not, right? And so in summary, wrapping up, I think that on critical minerals and the battery industrial ecosystem more generally, an ideal endgame would probably entail, yes, a level of stronger resilience, a degree of de-risking, but also adopting the frame of speeding up the transformation of the Canadian economy to tackle the fourth industrial revolution and grow stronger from it. And this means reinforcing domestic strengths and the Canadian advantage, thinking about industrial ecosystem and how China fits in it, right? Not all Chinese inputs are equal. So accept that a degree of interdependence and learning may actually be positive. In the end, however, one of the roles that I think we can play as academics is to keep an eye on where the limits to securitization in the economic spheres should be. The trade-offs implied in the over-securitization, the second order's impacts in the weaponization of resource procurement. The arc of history may be longer than some of us thought, but let it be known that we're working towards global interconnectedness as an end and not the other way around, essentially. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pascale. That was great. I'd like to pick out a couple of points of the many great points you raised. This first issue of kind of adding on to what Ari said in a broader taxonomy that goes beyond principles to not just de-risking, but decoupling, disaggregating, but cooperating and sharing and interconnecting and balancing. The other issue concerns the green tech example that you brought up. And that links to the earlier discussion of high value add and how we cannot become prosperous, a Canadian economy, without driving forward with high value added goods production. If we, energy exports are super, super important, but if we remain on that trajectory only, you become an economy like the Russian economy, the DR Congo economy. So high value add, there's a real opportunity here, which kind of aligns with the Build Canada Strong program, but to go beyond steel and lumber and the raw materials and to look at things like sophisticated HVAC systems as well. They're the goods that the rest of the world needs and wants. And if we can make those, that positions us on the value chain in ways that are succinct and definitive and offers products for trade diversification, because you can diversify your markets, but you need products to diversify markets. So I'm just trying to link some of these themes and these good points you raise with what we heard this morning. I'd like to now invite Konstantin to give us an in-depth insight from industry as a renowned practitioner in this area. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Anne. Good morning, late morning, or afternoon, as of 5 minutes ago. This is great. I mean, I can't tell you how happy I am to be associated with the Asia-Pacific Foundation and the Critical Minerals Hub. We had a fantastic event in Vancouver a few months ago, hugely enjoyable, and I think this is really important work. So I spent 6 years of my life about a couple blocks away on the other side of University College at the Faculty of Engineering. I was a slow learner. It took me 6 years. I did a graduate degree. And then my first job was with Imperial Oil, Exxon. I lasted for 2 years. I got out and I joined another American company, Praxair, Linde, Union Carbide, the industrial gases folks. And then in 1993, I joined a friend who was starting up this company, which today is Neo Performance Materials, a Canadian company listed on the TSX, headquartered a few blocks south of here, from which I retired for the third time about 3 years ago. The company set up, bought controlling interest in 2 Chinese rare earth refineries. This is back in the 90s when China opened up access to its rare earth sector. We got in, and for the next 30 years, and I have the scars to show for it, I had a front row seat in how China went from a fairly backwards industrial society to a very modern one, as well as all the regulations and how they unfolded and various strategies. So one of the things that I did is I followed China's 5-year plans, which is something that in the West we mostly neglect, which is unfortunate because China will tell you exactly what their priorities are and what they're going to do about it. And I find it inexcusable that we wake up every 10 years or so and realize, oh my God, I mean, they're dominating A, B, and C because we've been asleep at the switch. I mean, we need to pay a bit more attention. In fact, after this, I'm at a Canada-China Business Council event looking at the latest 5-year plan and dissecting it. But I'll start with some comments to set the background, how we got to where we got. And I'd like to remind everybody that it seems that we go into a critical minerals, which is the current term, but it's been a rare earth crisis every decade to a decade and a half, whether it was the .com collapse in 2000, or the Diaoyu Senkaku Island fiasco in 2010, when there was an embargo of rare earth exports to Japan. And then, of course, now with, in response to the weaponization of trade by the White House, the Chinese responded by weaponizing rare earth exports and rare earth magnet exports and so on. So I think we need to be absolutely clear. I was very determined, and I was telling people that one of the things that I've observed in China is the Chinese government, at least, and the bureaucrats are extremely good students of history. They learn from their mistakes, and they learn from other people's mistakes. So the 2010 debacle was not going to be repeated. In other words, the country that suffered the most from that embargo was China. By cutting off exports of rare earths to Japan, eventually the Japanese manufacturers of very sophisticated components ran out of rare earth inventories and stopped shipping components to China. So all those plants in the Dongguan to Shanghai corridor, assembling electronic devices and mobile phones, and et cetera, laid off hundreds of thousands of people because they ran out of Japanese parts that were using rare earths from China. So this is an example of trade globalization being a force for good. And we shouldn't forget that. So how did China get to where it got? So first of all, the idea that capital markets and publicly listed companies will solve this problem is not valid. Because I can tell you that as a public company CEO, I had to compete against Chinese companies that had access to capital that was unlimited, access to capital, access to unlimited capital at a negative cost. And I would live and die by my share price. And my share price is more dependent on return on capital invested. And all my Chinese competitors had to do is break even. Because of their negative cost of capital, they were making money. And if there's any bankers in the room that look at me like I'm from outer space, how is it possible? It is possible if you're playing with other people's money. And debt that you never have to pay back, and so on and so forth. So all they have to do is break even. And I needed to return 15% on my investment, which means my prices were inherently much higher than my Chinese competitors. So that doesn't work. And this is finally the realization that is hit home, and the White House has opened the purse strings and made billions of dollars of low-cost, free capital to American companies to invest in, I think, in absolutely the wrong things, but we'll get to that. So access to capital and the cost of capital is critical, especially because we're talking about highly opaque markets. There's no LME where you can trade neodymium and praseodymium for magnets. So you are dependent on non-transparent markets. 70% of whose consumption is in China, and China plays a massive role in dictating prices. I'm not calling it price manipulation, but the pricing environment for rare earths really serves the interests primarily of Chinese domestic industry and Chinese consumption. That's how they build the fabulous motors and batteries and cars and wind turbines that use all these critical minerals as inputs, at the expense of course, everybody else around the world who tries to compete with them. So access to capital and cost of capital. Second, we seem to forget at times that supply chains are built by demand. They're demand driven. Everybody should reread and reread and reread Michael Porter's book from 1989, The Competitive Advantage of Nations, which is what I've observed that happens in China. I mean, in China, you have these ecosystems that Tesla is a great example. When they built their gigafactory in Shanghai, they were able to access critical parts and assemblies that were off the shelf. So I don't know if you read the article this past week either in the Globe or the Star, about the new Tesla Model 3 rear-wheel drive that's coming to Canada at $39,000. It's not made in Fremont, California. It's made in Shanghai. And there's a reason why it's so cheap, and there's a reason why it's so good, and it's the same reason why Tesla is making more money selling a $39,000 Canadian Model 3 than a $60,000 US Model 3 made in Fremont. So the ecosystems that have been created in China work, but it's taken 30, 40, 50 years and a very focused industrial strategy. And we need to learn the right lessons from that. So without demand, supply chains in the West are going to have a hard time, which brings me to the point about what the American created bubble in rare earths means. I mean, we've had billions of dollars thrown in towards MP Materials, USA Rare Earths. I need to be careful because some of these guys are clients of mine. A couple of magnet companies, a German EVAC, to create an environment where rare earths are produced in the US and magnets are produced in the United States for defense. Well, guess what? Anywhere you cut anyhow you cut the numbers, defense demand is no more than 2% of the total. So the Chinese are building these industries based on EVs, wind power, electronics, and we're trying to recreate these supply chains in North America based on a small fraction of overall demand. And we go about it based on very wrong information, but this is not the forum to debate that. Finally, there's a third point that I wanted to raise, and that is a blind spot collectively we have in the West. I was reading a statistic, I use a statistic from the OECD about how many STEM grads China graduates versus the rest of the world. The latest statistic I saw, it was 300,000 engineers or STEM grads. I'm getting a little older, so I forget. We graduate in North America versus 5 million in China. In China, I would hire kids right out of university, put them in my plants, and they would be immediately productive. Anywhere else, I'd have to hire really smart kids, train them for 3 years before I let them touch anything. And so it will take time to get to a space where we have the right minds, the right skills, the right capital structures, and the right demand profile. And there's no magic bullets. It will take a while, and it will take commitment. Finally, I think we also might be a bit controversial here, a bit of an iconoclast, but so be it. We need to stop shooting ourselves in our collective foot. Or a hockey analogy would be, we need to stop scoring in our own net. I will bring up an example as quickly as possible. 2016, together with 3 other colleagues, we created a new company, an exceptional lithium asset in Argentina, listed it on the Toronto Stock Exchange. We had investors from around the world, mostly Canadian institutional funds, and CATL, the big Chinese battery manufacturer, who bought 8% of our company. And then in 2021, after 12 months of running a global process headed up by the Bank of America, we needed money to develop the asset and go into production. We went to every potential American partner, every German and European partner, every Korean and Japanese partner. They all passed. We got 3 bids from 3 different companies in China. We ended up selling the company for $960 million to Zijin Mining after Investment Canada review. We played by the rules. We did everything by the book. What happens as soon as the announcement goes out? Oh, and 98.7% shareholder approval. And of course, we're a public company board. We serve at the pleasure of our shareholders. My fiduciary duty, we all know what our fiduciary duty is. So immediately, the leader of Her Majesty's, back then we had Queen Elizabeth, Her Majesty's loyal opposition started screaming from the rooftops, how dare we allow the sale of Canadian critical mineral companies to the nasty Chinese? Well, the asset was in Argentina. 150 employees were in Argentina and 2 employees in Canada, and we followed all the rules. Reflexively, the former Liberal government brings in a new rule that prohibits Chinese investment in any Canadian critical mineral companies. This was the money that was oiling the wheels and was allowing entrepreneurs to explore for critical minerals in Canada. The moment that possibility was taken off the table, we've seen a series of exploration companies fall by the wayside. And, as I was saying earlier in a social conversation, at a lunch with 7 friends who run funds in London about a year ago, they told me that they wouldn't touch any investment in Canada because of that rule. A, you don't have the ability to form capital formation in the critical minerals exploration space without some Chinese involvement is very, very difficult. And then by removing the possibility of a sale to a Chinese company that tends to pay extremely high multiples meant that risk capital from Europe was stopped flowing into the Toronto Stock Exchange, where historically half of the world's resource investments get financed. So to me, that's a known goal. I mean, what are the Chinese going to do? Put the deposits on a boat and ship them to China? Allow investment and then regulate it as long as there's buyers in Canada or North America or allied states, you know, you follow a new set of rules. But don't chop off, you know, hit the exploration environment at the knees, because that's how future mining companies get created. And finally, I think we need to get beyond our traditional Canadianness of thinking ourselves as hewers of wood and drawers of water. I mean, come on, digging holes in the ground has got to come to an end, if that's an end in itself. We have very bright people in universities across the country, research institutions. A lot of this money that the government is earmarking for defense and industrial base and so on needs to be targeted towards smart people with really good ideas to develop the next generation of technologies that will enable the supply chains to come together and create the skills that we will need in the next few years if we're serious about what we're talking about.
Thank you so much, Constantine. Really some great points there. Your last point about it links to the whole change narrative I think that we need. I was in London a couple of nights ago and I heard similar noises, irrespective of what's now going on in the world since you had those conversations. And I think we should remember what President Trump stood up and announced in Michigan only about a month ago to the auto workers. He said, I'm very happy to produce Chinese electric vehicles here in the US, as long as they're manufactured here by US standards. And that is where I'm not sure our policy orientation has pivoted sufficiently. So beyond the machine knowledge capital, beyond the data-driven economy with wealth capture of 92% of the S&P 500 in intangible assets, is the recognition that power now exists at the technical level. The United States has pulled out of 66 different international treaties, conventions, and agreements over the past year, but they haven't pulled out of 3. The Electrotechnical Commission, the ITU, the Telecommunications Union, and the ISO, International Organization for Standardization. Why? It wants leadership in those areas because it's rushing to do what China did. To your point, locking down the industrial strategy and realizing the strategic importance of patents and IP and locking them down at every stage. And, you know, power is guided at this technical level now. And as somebody who's concerned also with graduates, I think we need to be teaching them the right stuff that our government policy needs to pivot to. The importance of IP, the importance of procurement, purchasing, value chains, and you can see the curriculum in China has gone that way already. So thank you for those comments. We'll build on them. Philip, over to you. I invite you to take the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne, and thank you to my APF colleagues, distinguished audience members, and Asian Institute and Munk School staff. This is a really spectacular event, and we're very happy to play a small part in it. So I'm a political scientist, and I don't have any practical industry experience like Constantine, so you should take everything I say with a suitable grain of salt. I'm mostly here to learn rather than to tell you about something. But I do know something about Japan and Japanese politics as well as its political economy. So I'll talk a little bit about that and perhaps touch on some things that might be broader lessons. So, for a little bit of background, Japan for many years very much bought into the GATT WTO regime and pursued free trade and broad supply chains as part of its global economic policy. And this is very much transformed over the past, say, 15 years or so. And a key turning point, really, as Constantine mentioned earlier, was the 2010 blow-up of the Senkaku Dayu territorial dispute with China, during which China responded by halting rare earths exports to Japan. And this was, I was in Japan at the time that this happened, and there was a very perceptible shock throughout the country that this was, a blatant coercion by a potentially hostile country of the sort that Japan really hadn't experienced since the end of World War II. There were tussles with the United States at various points, but this seemed to be in a different kind of category and signaled a change in Japan's place in the world. And it really led to a rethinking of everything from supply chain risk to various forms of vulnerability, the need for diversification. I've written in my own work that Japan is sometimes a harbinger of issues that are to come in the world on things like demographic change, because it's an early aging society, economic crises, and so forth. But I think economic security somewhat fits into this role because Japan got started quite early, right? So over 15 years ago now, and really because of its early brush up with China and its deep integration into Asian supply chains. And so what does Japan's response look like? So the Abe government, which ruled from 2012 to 2020, was really where much of this effort started, and really focused on understanding the supply chain risks, beginning some efforts on de-risking, moving supply chains out of China into somewhat less unstable countries, seeking alternative sources. I mean, this is all very much a work in progress. But under the Kishida government in 2021, 2024, I would say the government essentially prioritized economic security and took it to the next level, right? There was establishment of a cabinet level minister of state for economic security, and the two people who occupied this role initially were Takayuki Kobayashi and then Sanae Takaichi, both very rising stars within the Liberal Democratic Party, the latter, of course, who is the current prime minister. So you can tell the degree to which the Japanese government sees this as a core issue, a real signal of priority. Takaichi, of course, considers herself, and I think this is legitimate, a policy wonk on economic security issues. The book that she put out in 2024 before she became prime minister was all about the very detailed nitty-gritty of economic security, supply chains, and so forth. And she has positioned this issue really as a centerpiece of her economic policy as prime minister. And so what does the Japanese approach look like? It is very much an all-of-government sort of approach, of the sort that wasn't really possible in the Japanese political system in the 1980s and 1990s. But thanks to administrative reforms and the creation of dedicated coordination mechanisms, very much focused on the prime minister's office, we now have very significant coordination across Japanese ministries in the security domain and the economic domain and other domains to try to come up with a robust and flexible approach. There have been several laws explicitly passed under the Japanese government. The Economic Security Promotion Act of 2022 is really the centerpiece legislation to look at here, and I won't go through all the details, but it basically creates government authorities in areas like supply chain vulnerability, critical infrastructure, and so forth, that creates the foundation for all of what has come since. There's been also a tightening of information security, which Japan used to be very bad at, right? Like Japan was considered very leaky and unable to keep secrets. And so that's been changed. In 2013, you had the Designated Secrets Act, and more recently, the Critical Economic Security Information Act. So Japan is doing all that it can to try to tighten its grasp on sensitive information. Currently in the Diet, there's a debate over the creation of a National Intelligence Council to coordinate intelligence gathering, as well as a potential counterintelligence law, because Japan sees intelligence and information as critical. How do you identify where the vulnerabilities are and try to prepare beforehand? Where are potentially adversarial powers going to push us if there is an issue where economic security comes into play? There was also an important amendment to the Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Act in 2019 that has tightened restrictions on inbound foreign direct investment, and basically in sensitive economic sectors, there's far greater government scrutiny of those investments. So in terms of key characteristics of the Japanese approach, I think it is fair to characterize this as a partial resurrection of industrial policy in a country that was very well known for industrial policy for much of the post-war period, but seemed to be moving away from it over the course of the 1990s and later. And so I think very much industrial policy is back, and Japan is transitioning gradually towards using its government institutions that were designed to push industrial policy for the purpose of economic security. And this makes sense to some degree because, of course, economic security is basically an issue where if markets are left to their own devices, you have the pursuit of low cost and economic efficiency, but you have the creation of potential choke points, vulnerabilities that might hurt a country's national security interests, and therefore some degree of government intervention may be necessary. But this means that you have to push private sector actors who might not really be interested in making those costly investments without subsidies or some sort of rules and regulations that force them to do that. And so, there are a variety, the list is very long, but for example, the Japanese government has implemented the so-called K program, Key and Advanced Technology R&D through cross-community collaboration, which is essentially an R&D program that tries to develop cutting-edge technologies in Japan and to create associated industries. So the recreation of an industrial support base in Japan for these industries of the future, so that Japan is both to some degree autonomous and indispensable, right? So that essentially it's a course correction from the previous status quo that has been assessed to have been giving China too much of these core industries and technologies, and Japan needs to bring some of it back. This is, of course, things like AI, semiconductors, next-gen batteries, and so forth. So very much the focus is on reestablishing Japanese technological and industrial leadership. Of course, just as is the case with other industrial policy interventions, we don't want to kind of exaggerate the positives here, right? There is always a risk that this ends up looking like regulatory capture and investment of government resources and ultimately unproductive investments. If you look at the long history of Japan's attempts to try to do this type of intervention where they're trying to create technology hubs in various Japanese regions or trying to prioritize investments in certain technologies, I don't think the track record looks particularly good. This is very difficult for governments to do. And so it has to be done skillfully, and Japan, to some extent, does have the institutions and public-private coordination to do this more so than other countries. But even for a country like that, I think there are considerable risks that things could not turn out as well as the current government hopes. Another key feature of the Japanese approach is that it is very much, of course, a policy directed towards China. I think if you look at Japanese government documents, it has a little bit of the feel of Voldemort and Harry Potter, where there are disruptive countries that shall not be named, right? And increasingly, I think the Japanese officials are comfortable naming China, so that's changed a little bit. But very much this is a policy that focuses on what do we do about this potential vulnerability and the potential leverage that China can bring to bear through weaponized interdependence. I think the risk here, of course, is that given the recent rise of populism in Japan, which is often driven by kind of a backlash against foreign immigrants and foreign tourists, it can get mixed up into sort of a xenophobic policy response, right? That essentially, you could end up having a very harsh policy against Chinese researchers, Chinese investors, property owners, and so forth. Again, maybe some of these responses are justified on economic security grounds, but it's very tempting if you are a populist or a very conservative politician to use that as a pretext to go after the kinds of people that you don't like anyway. And so, I think currently in Japan, it's very much full steam ahead on this agenda, but in a country like Canada, I think it's well worth thinking about those kinds of knock-on effects that might be very problematic. And I think another key characteristic is really the integration of economic security as a core component of Japan's foreign policy approach. And this is very clear under Takaichi. In particular, she was just in Vietnam a few days ago updating the free and open Indo-Pacific and putting economic security very much at the center of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And this is somewhat new, right? It was there before, but the centralization is a key aspect. And I think this makes sense in the sense that many of these types of investments that need to be made in critical minerals and so forth can't be done by just one country, and certainly not by Japan, which is lacking in some of the key natural resources that would be necessary to reduce dependence on critical minerals and so forth. And so I think this is very much a good example of the sort of variable geometry that we've been talking about, where Japan is very much willing to cooperate and set up new frameworks to do more things with countries like Canada and other like-minded partners. So I think this is very much an area where Japan is willing to commit resources and assume a leadership role, but they'll need help from other corners. And I'll close on a key question. I think, one place where I think Japan differs somewhat from Canada is in the assessment of who are your true friends and who can you trust when you're thinking about economic security. If you look at the trade deal that Japan signed with the United States, there's a $550 billion investment into the US economy, and that is very much focused on economic security related investments in energy and semiconductors and so forth. And so the assumption there is that the United States is safe, and the United States will not weaponize this newly created dependence and hit Japan back or try to use coercion against Japan. And perhaps that's a reasonable assumption, and perhaps Japanese diplomats are skilled enough to continue to manage US governments so that that vulnerability does not materialize. But I think that is very much a question. So if you shift your risk from China to some other country, is that country safe? Are they going to weaponize that vulnerability against you? How do you assess the trustworthiness of your partners? And I think that's a significant question for both Japan and Canada moving forward. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. Okay, before I turn it out to questions from the floor, I'm just going to attempt to synthesize some of the key themes that have emerged in what has been shared by these three eminent speakers. I think the first theme is the evolved narrative, which is really necessary, one that moves away from hostility and no-go, and one that picks up on something you said, Philip, about what Japan does, gears its strategic direction around China. We need to do the same. It relates to what you said, Pascale, about looking hard at China's strengths and weaknesses, and this notion of shared resilience if China's not safe, then we're not safe in many ways. So evolving the narrative. And this also links into what our keynote speaker said earlier on about the importance of China expertise and knowledge. The second thing I picked up was this issue of, if we're going to change the narrative and we're going to talk about decoupling and balancing and disaggregating and not just de-risking, then we need criteria against which to make those decisions or to guide those decisions. And this is somewhere that the middle power discussion could go. Middle powers cannot be rule takers only. They have to be rule makers as well, especially in sectors that they deem to be so strategic. And it's a no-brainer that the new general purpose infrastructure is going to empower every sector, even the most traditional sectors of the economy, like forestry and mining. So we need to have rules in those areas. Doesn't matter if they differ a bit to even long-standing partners. But that's a conversation that could bring the middle power rhetoric to hard outcomes. Also a conversation around China and evolving the narrative. That could move forward the middle power issue, which remains conceptual only at the moment. The other thing all three speakers focused on was industrial strategy. And I would underline the word strategy because we haven't been brilliant at strategy here in this country. And strategy requires some visionary capacity. You're not going to achieve anything strategic in 4 or 5 years, right? But you need to be able to look out and say, okay, well, here's what I want to focus on now in the next 5 years or 4 years. And that'll get us to here. And then we can do this. And that'll get us to here. And, this taps into what Philip said about what we can learn from Japan, about their whole of government approach, their linked approach. And actually, Canada was one of those countries that socialized the idea of joined up government and whole of government approaches. So, and yet we don't have a National Security Council, anything that really brings those key cabinet functions together at the strategic level. We have a defense industrial strategy, but no defense strategy. We have an AI strategy, but we don't have a data strategy, which is going to undermine anything we do in AI and sovereign compute if we haven't secured and harnessed our Canadian data. So we need a sovereign digital spine in all those areas and look at the ecosystem that brings it together. And lastly, and really, this is where the likes of China and US scrambling to go in that direction they actually brought together a coherent system of policies that threaded together, and you can see that with the US AI strategy, the national standards strategy, the national security strategy, the IP march-in rights, and the Genius Act. They all come together like a coherent system that's kind of being weaponized against other countries, and we need to develop our system. It requires joined upness and linkages. The last theme I'll highlight was this issue of pouring money into R&D, which you triggered, Philip, looking at lessons from Japan. It was interesting, a few weeks ago, Harvard economist Ricardo Hausman was down in Waterloo, and he gave a lecture on productivity, and he debunked a lot of the theories in the literature on the decline of Canadian productivity. And he pinpointed the one thing in his view, which was really undermining productivity here, and was that big organizations do not invest in R&D. And all the other countries, even smaller countries like Australia and New Zealand and others, their big firms invest in R&D, and that's what helps grow SMEs and address the productivity crisis. So thank you, all three of you. I'm going to open the floor. Microphones are roaming, so please speak up and comments, questions. We warmly invite you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the panel. I actually met Constantine before in a class last year. So my question to you, I am a banker, so I'm going to ask a question about capital. So the access to capital, cost of capital issue, that was very interesting. And I'm trying to understand it better. because how does China then, and linking to Lizzie's point about structural upgrade, right? So if you don't have to worry about access to capital and cost of capital, what gives the businesses or companies incentive then to innovate, right? To get better at what they do? So that's my question.
That's, Sabrina, beautiful question, but it could take a while for an answer. You see, it's the ecosystems in China that innovate. When you look at the latest battery developments, most of them have come out of the University of Chengdu with a world-class, massive R&D center. And you know, the new sodium battery came out of that. That research from all the government-funded institutes then gets handed to the big players like CATL, BYD, and they introduce those technologies as next-generation batteries into their system. So the big companies do a lot of applications or applied research as opposed to blue sky type research. And in all my conversations in China, the fundamental research, mostly, the vast majority of it is done in government institutes like the Baotou High-Tech Rare Earth Institute, that is a leading force in rare earth production development. But then when it comes to making magnets, the highest performance magnets for electric motors, all that work is done at the company itself. So it's a very collaborative effort between government-funded research and applied research at the companies. In terms of capital, there's just every single company that I've ever competed against in China, you know, over terrible alcohol in China, they will tell you that the vast majority of their loans do not have to be repaid. They're eventually forgiven. As long as they are in the critical sectors that have been identified in the 11th five-year plan in 2012, those 8 strategic emerging industries, they've had access to unlimited capital. And those are the industries where emerging companies were being nurtured, protected, until they reached critical mass, and then they were left on their own devices. And that's how companies like CATL, BYD, and some of the other global energy transition behemoths have come into existence. And that also contradicts what is going on in the United States today, where it's another paradox that it's one of our favorite words with Pascale, where you have all this incredible amount of money being given to companies to establish supply chains in critical minerals, while at the same time, the same government that's giving the money is kneecapping the 2 largest applications for these critical minerals, namely wind power and electric vehicles. So, because they're solely focused on defense, which at the end of the day, unfortunately, I think where we're going with this is, without civilian demand developing, you will end up with massive overcapacity, producing materials and components for a defense industry that could not on its own base load a single plant through that supply chain.
Yeah, great, thank you. Could we take any more questions together, and then I'll give the panel. Okay, I've got one here, and then Dan, and then Jeff.
Hi. My name is Tabriz. I work for Dell Technologies. I've worked for the last 15 years, I've worked in China, Singapore, India, US, and now Canada for 2 years. One thing came out very clearly to me, that markets need to play as per their core. China, if you look at, they have their own core and they are playing. I'm a patent attorney, and I see beautifully they are from 2013 onwards, they are one of the largest patent filer. But they blend it in their product because they have to sell the product to the global markets, and that's a beautiful strategy. India plays on number and low-end IT services. What do you think Canada has core competence, and what strategy you will suggest to push it. As a patent attorney, I feel Canada has tremendous advantage in technology, and world is looking at not to be on either US or Chinese platform. What's your thought?
Okay, I'm going to take the other questions, and I'd ask you just to ask short questions, please. Dan.
Yeah, so the 2010 incident between Japan and China, basically self-correcting because it was a stupid move and it cost China and they backed out. I think Japan invested in rare earth mines in Mongolia or something.
Linus.
To what extent
Australia.
can we just leave this to the market to correct? Because most of these moves are going to be basically self-defeating.
Super, thank you. Just one at the back, and then up to Jeff after.
Hello, my name is Justin. I'm sorry, I'll try to flesh out the question the best I can. We've discussed, or at least touched on history and historical examples, and it makes me think what the years preceding the First World War, or Second World War, we saw that the economy was, slowing down, and then the military-industrial complex, alongside some other adjacent industries, decided to kind of attract more investment and stimulate the demand and etc. Basically, the question would be, could you please, and I don't know whoever chooses to answer this question, could you please reflect whether the risk is real if the economies are slowing down in some of the superpowers, and what we're seeing across the border in the south, that the risk of a military escalation is becoming unmanageable or maybe too high. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And final question, Jeff Nankerville in the front.
Yeah, thanks for terrific, thought-provoking presentations, all of you. Philip, I'm interested. We haven't heard much about South Korea in this. We had a little bit of Taiwan earlier, but and looking at it, from a Japan politics point of view, what's the outlook for Japan, South Korea strategic cooperation? In the coming years, do you foresee any potential for significant change, or will it be kind of business the way it has been, and how's that viewed in the Japanese political system?
Philip, let's start with you on the responses, and then you guys can pick up whatever it is you'd like to respond to.
Sure, absolutely. I'll start with Jeff's excellent question. So I think if you talk to people who are involved in the trilat between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea under Biden, they'll tell you that a fair amount of that discussion was based on economic security issues. And in fact, this was an area where there was considerable agreement and therefore less difficulty in pushing that cooperation forward. Of course, the key sticking point between Japan and South Korea has always been issues about historical memory and World War II atrocities and so forth. And so, if you move to things that are about current policy cooperation, the overlap in interests is very significant. And I think to a degree, this is the reason why Japan, South Korea is still quite good, despite the turnover we've seen in leadership across all three of those countries at this point. There isn't too much of a sign that we're going to have another reversion to a point of hostility among Japan and South Korea. And my sense is that economic security is very much at the forefront, given both countries' deep integration into supply chains and their dependence on China in very key ways, and their experience with coercion by China in the economic domain. So I think that is currently at least a promising area. Could flare up again for surprising reasons if certain people do certain things. I think on Dan's question about can the market solve this issue, I think the issue the problem is that there's a time horizon problem that essentially in the private sector, I think, oftentimes you care about shareholders and demonstrating returns and so forth, and you might not have, unless you have free access to capital, the wherewithal to stay in business long enough to wait for the correction to take place. And I think the economics literature is quite clear that because of agglomeration effects and path dependencies and so forth, if you're hollowed out, it's very difficult to recover from that. So I don't think it's the case that if you just leave things to the markets, this issue will simply resolve itself. There is room for the government to step in, but I think it's very well possible that what we're seeing now is a bit of an overcorrection in which governments are playing too much of a role, and there's certainly costs associated with that.
Thanks so much. Can we go to Pascale next?
Thank you. Great questions. I'm thinking a lot these days about, and this is sort of answering your question, Dan, second-order effects of weaponization of economic intercourse, right? And I think that one thing that we can do, certainly as scholars, is really try to map out and reflect deeply on the consequences, unintended and negative, of the U.S.'s weaponization of its own, high-tech space vis-a-vis China. What kind of resonance this has had in the Chinese system, and then vice versa, the second-order sort of negative impacts of China's weaponization of rare earths technologies, etc. At the very moment where China is trying to maintain open access for its export markets, it is really undermining trust in the narrative that China is trying to push out there of being a reliable, predictable, and stable, sort of counterexample to the US. And I don't think, so in other words, these are real consequences that are not really easily corrected by markets, because they touch on deep issues of perception, and there's a self-fulfilling prophecy, a dynamic that is difficult to stop, right? It's almost like as if this cycle has a momentum to it. And so it is incumbent upon us, I think, in this room and beyond, to think about the ways to diffuse this negative security dilemma dynamic, really, it's what it is. And this is maybe addressing the question at the back a little bit about risk of conflict. It's built into that, right? That negative dynamic could indeed, increase the risk of a hot conflict. And I think that middle powers like Canada can play a role in trying to adjust the balance between essentially is autonomy and entanglement, and continue to adjust this and diffuse entanglements, build overlapping, non-symmetrical coalitions of countries that advance certain problem solving in a way to prevent conflict as being sort of too easy to fall into, right? We are facing this we have to actively try to find exit areas and sort of ramps and diffusion mechanisms to the bilateral sort of escalatory dynamic that has developed. We should actually actively try to resolve that as a problem, as a wicked problem, right? To find the right solutions to that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, is that possible?
If possible. Yeah, I haven't mastered the 5-second clip. There's some really useful examples of how states have succeeded in some of the measures. Japan is one. After 2010, they invested about $250 million in Lynas, an Australian mining company. They threw all kinds of technical support as well. And today, after, Lynas spent 20 years as a junior miner, so that capital has to be very patient. Today, Lynas is the largest producer of rare earths, the largest miner outside of China in Australia, and the largest refiner in Malaysia. Last month, Japan did a deal with the government of Malaysia to bring in state-of-the-art, environmentally sound extraction technologies for Malaysian resources, and with an offtake in favor of Sojitz. that will likely go to Linus and also go to a European company that that Japan Inc. has invested in. The other successful example, at least in its early stages, is what Brazil is doing. Brazil has tremendous resources, and my conflicts on the table. I am advising BNDES, the development bank, and what they did is they created a sovereign fund, half of it from the taxpayer, the other half from family offices and wealthy companies like Vale put $200 million into it. And here's the remarkable thing for a government-led initiative. They hired 2 financial managers that are arm's length from the industry or capital in Regia, or investments in Regia Capital to manage the fund. And of course, they made their first investment in an Australian extraction company in Brazil. So the markets by themselves, no chance, because these are small, high capital intensive industries, and you cannot compete against what I talked about in terms of capital availability. Governments by themselves will not do it either because they don't have the skills and the understanding of markets. So you need to have a much more collaborative process. And finally, in a country like Canada, we need to be working a lot more closely with like-minded nations, Japan, the European Union, of course, Australia, a lot of the names that we heard, because there needs to be massive collaboration if that gap is going to close, which China is so far ahead. In order to close that gap, you need a lot of collaboration at the R&D level, at the academic level, and then the industrial supply chain, all the way down to the production of the final components. No state alone is going to get there. I don't care who it is. And no actor by themselves will get there without an awful lot of help from government.
Thank you. Thanks for being so efficient. Vina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne, and panelists. Please join me in giving them a warm thank you for sharing all of that. I will be extremely brief because I know I'm standing between you and our networking lunch, which I hope all of you will join us because we've had a rich 4 hours. I certainly feel much smarter than I was at 9 a.m. This morning. I hope you've also taken quite a bit from this conversation. We were quite ambitious in the way that we set up today's symposium in an effort to showcase the tremendous work done by our 4 John McArthur Fellows who were looking at critical minerals as well as technology-enabled trade and supply chains, but tried to bring that research into a broader conversation about Canada's economic competitiveness and industrial strategy, and also reimagining what trade diversification would look like today. Because this is not just about diverting trade, doing less trade with the US and doing more trade with Asia. This is looking totally in a different way around what is trade diversification in a moment that we're living in, as Dan mentioned, in a world of machine knowledge capital, as well as in a world where China is prioritizing the 3 sort of trends that Lizzi mentioned in terms of a real drive for technological self-sufficiency, this real focus on rewiring global supply chains and de-risking and decoupling from the US, but becoming integral to Asia's economy, but also to global economy, and all of what that means then with respect to overcapacity and the rest of the world managing its relationship. How do we take full advantage of what China brings to the table, but also at the same time continue to be able to protect and compete where we have to, and do that in a way that deploys private sector, state capacity, and knowledge economy, the expertise that exists within our universities and other organizations, in a way that we haven't had to do until now. In some ways, China has had a head start in not eroding its state capacity to engage in these kinds of big industrial projects. Some countries, like in Japan, in Asia, there is some of that expertise, which is why we need to partner with fellow democracies in the region, but that this would require the kind of effort that we haven't yet seen, but yet the ambitions is there. So this work will continue. As Pascale mentioned, we have the Critical Minerals Hub, which I hope all of you will be checking out, including the podcast. We will continue to do series on AI-enabled trade and what that means, and digital economy, including in the lead up to the APAC summit in China. So we will be doing some events leading up to November. And of course, we also will be looking at China specifically. So in the lead up to the President Trump and Xi summit, we'll be doing some webinar series, which I hope all of you will be joining in, to make sense of how that relationship is evolving and then what that means for us. So that all of that is coming up in the next few months. Thank you again so much to everyone at the Munk School and the Asia Institute, as well as our own team at the Asia Pacific Foundation, to Charles Lebrecq, as well as the Toronto team led by Christine Nakamura, for making today's event possible, and for all of our fellows, as well as for all of you for joining us. So thank you so much, and hope to see you at lunch. Take care.